Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is distorted reality in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 15, Tales of B.A. Singh S.E. The Tale of Aang. Avatar. Your favorite Pi Show Club is ready to give you your first job to prepare you for initiation. Go to the following locations throughout the city and say these words to the people you will find there, and they will hand you packages. They may or may not be affiliated with the Pi Show Club. Time is of the essence. So is discretion. You are not to look inside any of the packages, or else the club will know you cannot be trusted. At the first location, tell the old man behind the counter, "Love is sweet until you bite your tongue, but don't lick the ice to soothe it." At the second, let your worries hang out to dry and speak not of the words in the wind. At the third, the warmth of hearth and home keeps away the chill of winter, but a quilt made with attention and care even more so. And finally, at the last, the flower that blooms in adversity is the rarest flower of all. Your doddering grandmother. Aang rolled up the letter, pondering the meaning of Kunna's words. He'd found the scroll at the front door first thing in the morning, but he had been looking forward to relaxing for once and spending the day with Appa and Sabi. The second page of the letter gave him specifics for each of the locations and directions for the place he needed to deliver them to at the end. He sighed and leaned against Appa. "Guess the White Lotus is going to keep us busy today, buddy," he said to the bison. "They want us to go all around the middle and lower rings." He leapt up on Appa's head, and the bison grumbled in something that sounded like determination. He held out his arm for Sabi to perch, but she flew into his lap instead, chittering at him until he scratched her belly. They took to the skies, and despite the steady approach of winter, the sun was bright and warm. He longed for the chance to fly around on Appa with nowhere to go in particular, but sadly that didn't seem to be his reality anytime soon. "We haven't had any time with just the three of us, have we?" he asked his companions. Sabi vocalized a response that he couldn't understand and nuzzled further into his lap. He held the letter in his hands as he let Appa circle far above the city for a bit, trying to determine the location of his first objective. Using the palace as his guide for cardinal directions, he calculated a rough approximation of each of his destinations. Aang was thankful that he had Appa to traverse the city this time around. All four spots were as far away from each other in the middle ring as they could be, while the place he had to deliver all the packages was in the lower ring, not far from where he had to go the night before to meet Kunna and Piandao. He steered Appa into a dive. The first location was down the street from a fountain with stone badger moles standing sentinel around it, spewing water from their mouths into a pool. Children played around it, trying their hardest to reach the coins glinting at the bottom of the pool without their parents noticing. All eyes in the fountain square looked up at Appa as he descended, but Aang had him land on a roof while he jumped down and headed for the first location. "Whoa, is that the Avatar? No way. He's a kid. The rumors are true. Look at that giant, fluffy monster. I wanna play with it. Avatar, can you help me? No one ever comes to my shop and we need some publicity." Aang politely waved away as many people as he could as they crowded around him, trying to smile but not used to this kind of attention anymore. Once upon a time he would have thrived on it. "I'm sorry, I'm kinda busy right now." The first location in the letter, it turned out, was a bakery. He breathed in the fresh bread and other sweet scents, but had to remind himself that there was no time for distractions. He spotted a portly man with a tuft of white hair behind the counter who peered at Aang through thick spectacles and smiled. "Hello, can I help you?" Aang scratched his head, trying to remember Kunna's proverb. "Love is sweet until you bite your tongue, but don't lick the ice to soothe it." The man raised an eyebrow and stared at him with confusion for a moment. Aang grinned sheepishly. "Oh. The order," the old man said, snapping his fingers. "Yes, I'll go get it." He disappeared to a room in the back, muttering something Aang couldn't hear, and returned with a woven basket that had a wooden lid he held with two hands and a leather drawstring bag on top of it. "Here you go." Aang took both, surprised at the weight of the basket when it made his knees buckle. Thanks." "You're welcome." Aang turned around and readjusted his grip on the basket, peering out the shop window when he heard Appa rumble. The sky bison had joined the children on the ground, letting them climb all over him and slide off of his tail into the fountain while other kids tried grasping at Sabi's tail as she fluttered above them. Aang joined them outside, leaping high to place the basket and drawstring bag in the saddle and secure them as tight as he could. The bag had something soft inside, like sand. He resisted the temptation to open either package. "Sorry, everyone," he said to all the people, waving as he jumped onto Appa's head for the reins. "I've really got to go. Avatar business." Sabi screeched and fell into Aang's lap again in relief. The following locations proceeded much the same way. Aang didn't know the purpose of the second location, which was a fairly dismal, empty building where a surly man with a scar on his brow sat on a stool and scowled when he came in. "Let your worries hang out to dry and, speak not of the words in the wind," Aang said hesitantly. "I don't need no advice," the man growled. He gestured to a large burlap sack that bulged with its contents. "But there, take it." "Weird kid." Aang frowned but hefted the sack. He couldn't even wrap his arms around it the whole way and it was even heavier than the basket. Thanks," he said before departing. On his way to the third location, when Appa dove for the landing, Aang happened to glance back and see something white spill out of the burlap sack and get lost to the wind and the city below. "Oh no!" he exclaimed, jumping back to the saddle and tightening the string around the top to seal it better. "I hope the White Lotus doesn't give me any points off for losing that," he muttered to Sabi. He found a pretty woman at the third location working in a textiles shop, a seamstress. The warmth of the hearth and the home keeps away the chill of winter, but a quilt made with attention and care even more so, he said. The woman seemed taken aback for a moment, but then she beamed at him. "Indeed." She dragged out a wooden chest, plain except for a bronze clasp keeping it shut. She was kind enough to hold one end of it while he brought it out to Appa. This was the heaviest package yet. "Thank you," he called out to her as they flew off. By the time he got to the fourth location, his arms ached with the knowledge that they'd be sore in the morning. He tried to piece together what sort of people the White Lotus Society could be, especially since the last place was a simple flower shop with a round-faced girl not much older than Aang behind the counter. Could she really be a member of the secret society? The flower that blooms in adversity is the rarest flower of all. The girl tapped her lips in thought. Strange request, but okay, I'll give it a go. You need a flower that blooms in adversity? I'd suggest fire lilies, they're found at the mouth of a volcano. Oh. Or how about a snow pansy? They grow best in the dead of winter, even during snowstorms. The snow pansy, I guess, he said, shrugging. Just a couple stems or a bouquet. The letter didn't say anything about that. The bouquet, maybe. Okay, gimme a minute, the florist said. She disappeared in the back and returned with an armful of blue and white flowers, speckled with something shiny that shimmered like ice when held up to the light a certain way. "Are these for a girl?" she asked, looking at him with a conspiratorial wink. Kind of," he said, scratching the back of his head. "My grandmother." "Oh. How sweet. I hope one day I have grandchildren who bring me flowers." She smiled as she worked at assembling the bundle into a bouquet. "I've always had a silly dream that the Earth King would come and bring me flowers one day," she said, giving a dreamy sigh to a portrait of King Ki on the wall. Aang looked at it too. The bespectacled king looked exactly the same as he remembered. But I suppose the Avatar would be the next best thing. He felt a blush rise to his cheeks and the back of his neck. What? The Earth King never makes public appearances anymore, so it's nice to see you show up here, she continued. "My name's Yin." "I'm Aang." "Well, it's nice to meet you, Avatar Aang," she said, handing him the bouquet. "Have a nice day. Feel free to drop by anytime." Thankful that the bouquet, at least, was a light package, he journeyed to the final location to make the delivery. It was, indeed, the same neighborhood in the lower ring he had been to the night before, and despite the fact that Kunna had led him by the arm through a maze of streets and alleyways, he was able to recognize the fact that the directions in the letter brought him right to Kunna's door. He knocked. The old waterbender opened the door, beaming in delight when she saw him. "You did it. Now help me bring everything inside." "What is all this stuff, anyway?" he asked as he began unloading the bison. He was hungry and kind of agitated now, and he felt a weight in his stomach as his previous suspicions niggled strongly at his mind. Kunna removed the lid from the woven basket. This is flour for baking, she said. She placed the drawstring bag on the counter, opening it so he could see inside. And sugar. I had hoped to make some cookies. Aang opened up the burlap sack, blanching when he discovered all sorts of undergarments he absolutely did not need to see. Guh. Kunna pouted at him and dragged the sack into her bedroom. You only have yourself to blame for that. This is my laundry. And the chest. Quilts and blankets. Winter is coming and I didn't want to get cold. The flowers. So I could get a little color in here, obviously. What about the codes? Were those proverbs? Kunna beamed. All nonsense I made up. Aang scowled. So wait, is any of this even for the White Lotus? Are you telling me that I spent my whole day running around doing errands for you? Kunna laughed. Well, having a flying bison makes it so much easier than forcing little old me to run around the whole city. Thank you for the help, dear. Think of it as payback, the look on your face when you saw my skivvies was more than worth it. Aang groaned and turned around to leave without another word, Kunna's cackles continuing on behind him. The tale of Azula and Toph. Azula stretched her arms above her head, lacing her fingers together as she enjoyed the feeling of the sun on her face. A sigh escaped her lips as she walked down the road alongside Toph. The Earthbender may not have been her first choice of companion for this beautiful day, but she didn't want to go shopping for supplies with Zuko, either. Instead, the two headed for a gazebo in the park where Azula had heard there would be an outdoor play. She hadn't told Toph about it yet. Azula suspected she would have no desire to go if she knew. The upper ring bustled with people today, idle men and women who had nothing better to do with their lives than walk under parasols and admire the topiaries and titter to each other about useless things. These people had no idea what truly lurked outside the walls of their precious city. A wolf whistle aimed in their direction pulled Azula out of her thoughts. It was a crowd of boys roughly the same age as her and Toph. Hey there, pretty lady. One of them shouted at her from down the street. How about you come hang out with us today? They didn't even spare a glance at Toph. Toph huffed and blew her bangs up. Oh, please, she said so only Azula could hear. Azula put a hand on her hip. And why should we? One boy, their ringleader, apparently, confidently strode up to them and brushed his windswept hair aside. 'Cause I think you're really pretty. And you think I'm good looking, right? Yeah, you said that already, Toph said, scowling. Yes, you're going to have to do better than that, Azula added, one eyebrow raised. But I suppose you are easy on the eyes. The boy seemed taken aback at that, but quickly recovered. Well, your eyes are beautiful, like money. And your hair is like silk. And your clothes. All right, Azula said, holding back a laugh. She glanced down the limestone street at the noble women who walked by with their hair done up in plaits and lips painted in all different shades of red. We'll come along with you as long as you treat us both like princesses today. Toph blanched. Wait, what? The boy glanced down at Toph and then shrugged. Sure, I guess. He looked back at Azula, grinning. Come with us to the park. Me and the boys got a bunch of vegetables to throw at some actors who are putting on a play or something. Well, that sounds stupid and senseless and almost as fun as just watching it, Azula said. I'm in. He ran back to his friends, but before Azula could follow after him she felt Toph pull on her sleeve. Wait. What is it? Don't you want those boys to fawn over us? She figured it would be a good distraction to get her mind off of Aang, then wondered why she thought that. There was nothing about Aang that occupied her mind any more than usual. He was just Aang, as infuriating and confusing as always. Or would you rather just see the play? Some people in my village used to put them on, and Zuzu, uncle, and mother liked them so I sometimes went. No, it's not that, said Toph. It's just. Those guys think you're so pretty and it's not like they're even gonna look twice at me. Well, I am pretty, Azula said. I am so glad that I can't see your face to confirm or deny that. She shrugged. I mean, growing up me and Smellerbee never really cared about that kind of thing. And all the boys were too afraid of us to say anything. It never mattered. Angela frowned but put a hand on Topha's shoulder in her best effort to be comforting. Well, my mother used to tell me there are more important things than just being pretty. You're strong and brave and you always speak your mind. You're annoyingly stubborn but fierce. I couldn't stand you when we first met but now I suppose you're a friend. Toph tilted her head. Thanks, I guess. She lowered her voice almost to a whisper. But, am I pretty? Angela finally realized the crux of the issue when she spoke as if admitting to a great secret. She thought Toph had never looked so small, so vulnerable, with her bangs covering her eyes and her face fixed on the ground. Humph. I never would have thought you'd have an insecurity like that, but if you must know. Yes, I think you are pretty. And you can tell when people are lying so you know I'm being honest. Yeah, you totally lied to that guy about being easy on the eyes, Toph said, grinning. She rubbed her palm at her eyes and Angela realized with a start that she had let a tear fall. But, thank you, Spice Queen. Angela clasped her hands behind her back and leaned forward, eyes glinting with mischievousness and a smile as poisonous as white jade. Now, what do you say we both go use our considerable powers of intimidation and make those boys slaves to our every whim? That sounds like a great idea. The tale of Zuko and Mai. It's still kind of hard to believe, Mai said, balancing atop a fountain with the ease and grace of a deer lynx. Looking at her from behind and below, Zuko couldn't help but admire the image of her standing in front of the sky at dusk. Orange and red and pink and blue all bled together like watercolors on canvas, like she swam in a sea of fire. Even though she only ever wore black and red, he thought she looked beautiful surrounded by so much color. Yeah, he said, transfixed. It is. She leapt down and landed on both feet seemingly without any effort, and it took Zuko a moment to realize the spell had been broken. You still have a hard time believing the Avatar, too. What? Zuko asked. He shook his head, banishing the fog around his mind. Oh, no. It's, kind of a crazy story, but I do believe him. The image of the scarred man who had given him fire-bending rose to the forefront of his thoughts, but Zuko shook his head to banish him, too. Mai crossed her arms and sat down on the edge of the fountain, staring up at the sky. This part of the upper ring was quiet and empty of people, as if it had been reserved only for them. It's weird to think that your sister killed me in that world. Zuko sat down next to her. She's not the same. His voice came out in a low rasp. You're not afraid of her, are you? It took Mai a moment to answer. No. But I suspect the other me was. Angela took it hard when Aang told us the truth, Zuko admitted. But, can I tell you something I haven't told Aang? She locked her eyes with his. What? Some guru told us that we have some spirits that kind of latched onto me, Angela, and Toph, he explained. But I don't think they're spirits. I saw him. He looked like me, but a bit older and with a scar over his left eye. And Aang said our two worlds are being forced together. You think it's that other Zuko? Yeah, he said. And that Zuko was a fire-bending master. I think he was the one who gave me the ability to fire-bend. And how does this spirit version of you manifest otherwise? She looked away. Not that I'm an expert on spirits or anything. I don't know, Zuko replied. I feel things sometimes that aren't me. Sometimes I have weird dreams. I heard his voice in the back of my head a few times, too, as if it was trying to tell me what to do. Well, I haven't heard any voices, Mai said. I guess the other me didn't care enough to hitch a ride. Zuko felt a tightness in his chest. Or maybe. He trailed off. Or maybe it's because she's dead, you were about to say. Mai huffed, her voice stinging like a buzzard wasp. Yeah. Maybe. Zuko remembered how the guru had said Teo, the astronomer's son, had some kind of spiritual presence around him, too, and wondered if that meant the Teo from Aang's world had tried to merge with him as well. But what about everyone else in the world? How far did this go? Why do you think that Mai ended up turning against Angela? Mai asked suddenly. Why the sudden show of morality after letting her princess commit all kinds of atrocities? I can't say for sure, Zuko admitted. Even Aang doesn't know. You had a best friend named Ty Lee who betrayed Angela along with you. But he did tell me that in the other world, you and I were kind of dating together. He cleared his throat, deciding it best to leave out the fact that Ty Lee was something of his ex-girlfriend in this world, and for the first time he wondered if he had that kind of relationship with her in Aang's world, too. Heat rose up around his neck and he searched for any change of topic he could grasp for, landing his eyes on the unlit lantern posts that dotted the outside of the square. Do you want to see how much I've practiced firebending? He stood up. Mai remained seated, folding her hands in her lap with an unreadable expression. Sure. Zuko took a deep breath and pointed at each of the posts in turn with 2 fingers, just like Azula had taught him. He felt the warmth rise to his fingers and let it out, thin bursts of fire shooting to the lantern wicks with pinpoint accuracy. He had Mai's training to thank for that part. He stood for a moment to admire his handiwork, the flames dancing like stars in the blanket of night that had fallen around them. He looked back at Mai, loving the way he saw her dark eyes reflect the firelight that made him think she had absorbed all the colors of the sunset into them. She stood up and walked over to Zuko, putting a hand on his lower back. It's pretty, she admitted. And in light of what you just told me, no one can say for sure what was going on in her mind, even Aang. But I think I'm the one in the best position to make a guess. She brought the fingers of her other hand gently to his chin, turning his face to look at hers. And I think she did it because the other me might have loved the other you. Mai kissed him and he felt himself sink into her touch, pressing his body against hers in a deep embrace. He felt all the warmth in the dusky sky flood into his being, in his lips and hers and in the hands that he pressed against her back and arm, and the acrid smell of smoke. Zuko! Stop! She exclaimed suddenly, pushing away from him. For a moment he was too shocked at the way she had raised her voice to do anything until he saw her batting furiously at her clothes, her long sleeves trailing black smoke. In a panic, he dove at her and they both fell into the fountain in a splashing mess of water and limbs. When she surfaced, black mascara had run down her cheeks and her face betrayed no amusement. You need to learn to control your fire-bending better. I'm sorry. He pushed himself to his knees and in his haste he slipped and fell, splashing her all over again. I'm still new at this. But that time she had finally smiled, just enough that it made all the tension leave Zuko and he couldn't help but laugh. The tale of Sokka and Suki. Sokka couldn't believe that Suki managed to drag him to a poetry house. He thought it a dinky establishment in the lower ring, and expected it to be full of high-strung, stuffy noble types, but it felt like a tavern that had been repurposed into something new, with all the bawdiness and charm that had entailed. He found it too dimly lit for his liking and the smell of old liquor and pipes permeated and settled into the wood over the years, but people of all types had come here, taking turns to spin their craft up on the raised platform they used as a stage. All of them added a certain amount of theatrics to their performances that even made Sokka, for one wild, brief moment that he quickly stifled, want to jump up and say something himself. Neither he nor Suki performed and listened in silence instead, not wishing to draw unwanted attention to themselves. Afterward, they walked along the winding city streets, their wanderings eventually taking them away from the Paper Lantern district. The wind carried music to them from some distant part of the city, flutes and strings weaving a melody that, for the first time in this city, made him feel at ease. So, did you like it? He asked Suki, speaking for the first time since they had left the poetry house. It was all right, she said with a non-committal shrug. It sort of reminded me of the haiku nights they used to have at my village. I thought I'd like this more. Your village? He asked. You remember? She had rarely spoken about Kyoshi Island in her time there before he knew her. Due to its proximity to the Southern Water Tribe, it had been one of the first Earth Kingdom territories to fall to their side in the war, long before either of them were born. But Suki had lived there until around the age of 5 or 6, when her people had rebelled and Sokka's grandfather swiftly crushed it. Sokka vividly remembered when his father returned home with Suki, adopting her as a ward of the royal family. It wasn't until years later that he had learned she was little more than a hostage to keep the village chief from rebelling again. It was Sokka's grandmother who had convinced Hakuda, when he became emperor 2 years later, to let her begin her Kyoshi warrior training, a part of their unique culture Gran had enjoyed, though his father thought it was little more than a style of dance, as did Sokka at the time. Suki was the last of them who still practiced the art. That train of thought led him back to his grandmother and he pushed it from his mind. A bit, yeah, she said, with a hint of finality that told Sokka she was done talking about it. Did you like it? The poetry? He scoffed. Dumb girly stuff. She raised an eyebrow and smiled. Yeah, sure. You were so transfixed on everyone that spoke I thought you were gonna cry at one point. No way. Your eyes looked all watery and everything. He was about to retort when he realized they had unintentionally walked into a square with a brick well tucked away from everything else against the wall to the outer ring, one of the potential rendezvous points with Katara. He shivered when a chill breeze blew through the empty square. They still hadn't heard anything from her and he knew Suki had begun to worry about her and you. Suki walked up to the well and brushed her finger along its rim, gazing down into its depths. Hundreds of them dotted the entire city, an integral part of their plan. Do you wish you was here with you in the city, while I was down there with your sister instead? She asked him without looking in his direction. He frowned. It was so like her to say exactly what was on her mind instead of letting it churn and stew into something greater. She was blunt and direct, a trait he admired about her that the women in his tribe tended to lack. Why would you think that? Well, I don't know, she said. You don't seem like you enjoy my company. We're here on a mission, he said. Something stirred deep inside him, the same part that urged him to rescue Toph as she lay in the middle of a dusty road, unconscious and dehydrated. A part that wanted nothing more than to hold Suki, an ache that felt like loss, hollow and biting. He pushed it down. It's not the time to enjoy anything. You and you were once betrothed, she said. Does it have to do with that? Just because our dads said so, he responded. And he had liked the idea, once upon a time. She had even come to live with his family, as another ward, though less of a hostage than Suki. Katara had been delighted to have two sisters, after that had been decided, giving the two the chance to know each other before they turned 16. But they had both been children, only 12 years old. He thought you had liked the thought of it as well, at least until she decided to become an acolyte at Avatar Kurek's water temple with all the other women sages. It had been her choice to null the betrothal. Listen, I don't know where this all came from. Why are you bringing up you? It wouldn't kill you to talk about your feelings sometimes, you know, instead of deflecting. She said, turning to him with her hands on her hips. The same strange feeling of loss bubbled up inside him when he thought of you, leaving Sokka confused more than anything. It's being here, he said finally. In this stupid city. It's the thought of my gran and that she did what she did. The thought of what their people had done, forcing half of the Earth Kingdom to cower behind these walls. Emptying out forests. Drying out swamps. The thought that some inexplicable part of him even liked it here, the poetry and the lanterns and the shops, the smell in the air of something cooking at all hours of the day or night, whether it was just some gruel or a meaty feast with scents of spices he could almost taste on his tongue. The music and the crowds had a warmth to them that his own city lacked. Or perhaps it wasn't the South Pole city that lacked all that, but just his palace. His old home. Do you hate her? Yes, Sokka said at once, but then he amended it just as quickly. No. I don't know. Well, I think you need to decide if you do or not, Suki said, crossing her arms. And what you'd do if you ever saw her again. He ran a hand through his loose hair and let out a breath that seemed to take all his stamina with it. I guess I do. Neither of them said anything after that. His head spun. Midnight had come and gone, but he had no desire to meander back to their apartment yet, only to toss and turn in his sleeping roll through the night. The faraway tune finally died off and everything became unnaturally quiet except for the running water below them, deep inside the well. But now that he heard nothing else, it sounded as if the water rushed faster, louder, rising up to meet them. Sokka? Suki asked, drawing away from the well. What is that? The water churned up from the shadows, bringing with it his sister, who stood at its crest and stepped off it, letting the swell wash around the square. She stepped out of the well, brushed dust off of her green dress and took a deep breath. She sighed, closing her eyes. My first breath of fresh air in days. Sokka knew she had taken the moment to relish the feeling of being under the moonlight again. He, like any waterbender, felt invigorated whenever his blood thrummed with its energy. He drew in close to her with grit teeth. "Are you an idiot? What if someone saw you? You coming up here wasn't part of the plan." Katara narrowed her eyes at him. "That's the kind of hello I get." She put a hand on her hip and glanced into the darkness of the well again. "Nothing's been going according to plan since this whole thing started." "That's your own fault," Sokka told her. "Maybe so," she admitted as Suki hugged her in greeting. "But I needed to get out of there for a bit." "What's going on?" Suki asked, brow furrowed in concern when Katara seemed unable to remove her gaze from the bowels of the city. Something about the way she looked down there unsettled Sokka, too. "Well, since yesterday, some of our men have been disappearing." The tale of Kunna. Kunna hummed to herself as she worked, shaping the dough and red bean paste together with her fingers. There was so much to be done, but baking gave her a measure of comfort and familiarity that she sorely needed. She felt alone in this city. She had Piandao, sure, but he was more of a colleague within the White Lotus. She had known him for almost as long as she had been a member. In that respect only, she was his junior. Besides, after the White Lotus set him up with his calligraphy job, he had spent most of his days there, providing a cover for them while she sat at home, his old mother who spent her time alone, the Avatar's secret liaison with the White Lotus. She hadn't always enjoyed baking. It was a hobby she had rediscovered during Prince Sokka's exile due to many nights at sea with nothing else to do. Before that, though, she loved cooking. Kunna didn't care that preparing food meant she dallied beneath her station. She was the queen consort and later the Moonlit Mother, a flowery title meant to convey some sort of importance as the emperor's mother, she always thought, but it was essentially no more than that, not a common servant. But her husband and later her son allowed her that fancy. They often partook in the fruits of her labor. After all, they had loved some of her signature dishes like seared seal meat glazed in a sauce made from ocean kumquats, Arctic fowl stew, or the plates of filleted fish with hearty vegetables imported from Kyoshi Island and beyond. Cooking was always something she could be proud of, something that was hers, not like the waterbending she had shared with Hama. It was a link to her memory of a distant home before she was shipped off to the south to marry a prince. She had loved another, back then, and had been loved in return. Pakku, too, had treasured her cooking. So when she found herself in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people, cooking was all she could turn to at first. For many years, it was hers. At least until later, after she had her own child, and another girl had been brought to the palace. Another girl in a situation just like hers, though from the southern penguin tribe instead of the north, like Kunna. The sweet smell of her mooncakes wafted through the air and she had not realized she had gotten so caught up in her thoughts and reminiscing and pulled them from the wood-burning stove when they had finished baking. She left them to cool on the windowsill and went back to arranging the bouquet of flowers that the Avatar had brought her into a vase. A few minutes later, she noticed tiny, grubby hands reaching through the window and plucking her warm cakes right from the plate. More hands followed shortly after, so she walked over to the window and peered out of it. Now, she said. You could have just asked, you know." A handful of children scattered but one remained, staring down at her toes with a sullen look. "I'm sorry," the girl said. She wiped some of the red bean paste off of her hands onto her plain frock, dirty and tattered in places. "But they smell good." Kunna looked her over, knowing a hungry child when she saw one. "Don't be, my dear. Go find your friends and tell them we can all share, I can't eat all of these by myself." The girl beamed and ran off, returning only moments later with the same children who devoured the plate in seconds. "Thanks, old lady. Those were yummy." "Just call me Gran, she said with a smile. "I guess I'll just have to make more, won't I? But it'll take some time, so go and play and come back later." Most of the children did just that, except for the one who stayed behind in the first place. She stared up at Kunna with wide green eyes, wringing her fingers together. "Can I help?" "Of course you can," she replied, and went to work to gather the ingredients in a bowl again. The girl propped herself up on her elbows, hanging on the windowsill with feet dangling outside. "Have you ever baked before?" "Yeah," she said. "Daddy used to let me mix." "Then that'll be your job again," Kunna said, handing her the mixing bowl and spoon. You must be an expert. Yeah. The girl's tongue poked out of her mouth as she worked, eventually sitting up on the sill completely to hold the bowl with her legs. He never does it anymore, she said. He's always so tired after working all day in the middle ring like Mom. That's far away from here. Oh, I bet, Kun-na said, offering an understanding smile. She figured most children in Ba Sing Se had a similar story, if they weren't orphans. He must work hard. The girl turned out to be a chatterbox, rattling off about all kinds of topics and concerns of a 7-year-old in the lower ring. Perhaps it was due to the memory being fresh in her mind, but Kun-na had been reminded of the girl, a teenager at the time, who came to the ice palace from the penguin tribe, whom she had taught to cook. Her son's betrothed, Kia. Kia had been alone, too. Afraid. A girl, like Kun-na, caught up in her tribe's traditions that had uprooted her life and made her decisions for her. Quiet and kind but eager to learn, braver than Kun-na had ever been. Over time, Kia had become something like a daughter to her. Cooking had become their tradition, a skill and hobby they had nurtured together. They had built a rapport with each other and found the strength to withstand the South Pole's harsh environs. The old woman had often wondered what destiny could have been in store for them had they been free to choose a life for themselves. What destiny Kia could have had if Kun-na had done what was right instead of remaining idle. But it was too late, and now Sokka and Katara had no mother. She saw Kia standing next to her, cooking with her, the girl she was when she first came to live in the palace. Then as a mother, her 2 children pulling at her skirts, both cherished despite Kia's own sad circumstances. She smiled at Kun-na and an icicle of guilt twisted in her chest. Old lady. The little girl asked, pulling her back to reality. What's wrong? Why are you crying? Kun-na hurriedly wiped her eyes. Don't worry about me, she said. Go on, run along, and find your friends again. The second batch should be ready soon. She frowned with concern brimming in her eyes but did as she was told, hopping off of the windowsill and disappearing into the city. Kun-na turned away from the window, her eyes falling on the snow pansies, and remembered the night she saw them last. The blizzard had raged and the wind howled that night as the tundra reclaimed one of its own. Chapter 16, Night of the 100 Revel Rise. So, you all really knew each other from the beginning. Iroh chuckled, grasping his belly that really didn't seem like much of a belly anymore. Not quite. We knew of each other's exploits and deeds within our society, but we haven't had the opportunity to all gather in person until now. Aang nodded at the answer to his question, but more sprung up from that. He wanted to ask more, needed to ask more. What society? Is that what Bumi meant by all old people know each other? Why didn't anyone tell him? Why not gather earlier, during the day of Black Sun that ended in so much failure and death? Why now, when the comet loomed only hours away? They had made camp outside Ba Sing Se, where Iroh's secret society planned to take back the city. Based on Zuko's information, they had a rough idea of where Oze and Azula would make landfall and begin their immolation of the Earth Kingdom. Team Avatar had come across Iroh's camp, a congregation of tents and people wearing indigo robes with white mantles, which Iroh himself wore even now, and the 2 of them sat together now in his tent, talking and going over strategies. Aang, your destiny, all of our destinies, will converge today. Everything will change from here on out, Iroh continued. I can feel it. Iroh. Bumi. Pakku. Zhang. Piandao. He was happy to see them all again, despite the circumstances, but dread broiled in his stomach and the fear of his impending confrontation with Oze almost made him sick. Iroh. I don't know what to do. Everyone wants me to end the Fire Lord but I don't know if I can. Trust in yourself, Aang, Iroh said. I know you will make the right decision and save the world. Iroh was right. From that day on, everything had changed. How am I supposed to fight in this? Aang asked, his face twisted into a grimace as he looked at himself in his mirror. He had been given a mustard yellow robe with a hem that nearly reached his feet, open but tied together at his waist with a black satin sash. His sleeves were wide but with thick black cuffs bordered in gold trim. Underneath the outer robe he wore a plain robe of a lighter flaxen color that itched and reached his knees, making the whole thing feel bulky and heavy. The outer robe's hem had been decorated with swirling cloud patterns. He appreciated the level of detail which even included a miniature sky bison flying among them. Completing the ensemble was a prayer bead necklace and plain, black boots. Mai gave an amused look to the necklace as he put it on. I suppose they remembered that you're a monk, at least. But you're not supposed to be fighting in that. We're going to a feast, not a battle. We never wore anything so extravagant back then, he replied. Whoever had designed this outfit had no idea what an air nomad actually was, it seemed. He looked himself over in the mirror again, brushing his hand through his neatly trimmed hair, courtesy of Mai. But that's easy for you to say. You don't have giant robes weighing you down. The Roku warrior, indeed, had managed to procure clothes for herself that gave much more freedom of movement. She wore black, as usual, with wide, billowing sleeves for concealing her multitude of weapons. Otherwise, she wore long boots and grey pants under a short skirt. Aang was used to seeing her in a longer dress, so it had the effect of making her seem taller. Combined with her sleeves that looked like wings, it gave him the impression of a sort of sparrow. Formal, but functional. Mai had the excuse of coming to the feast as the Avatar's bodyguard, not a guest like the rest of them. She shrugged at him and folded her hands in her sleeves. Shall we go downstairs and join the others? He nodded and she led the way. Zuko, Azula, and Toph were already waiting for them by the door, ready to leave with varying levels of reluctance. Took you long enough, Toph said when they arrived. She wore a hanfu in a pale green color, with a darker green scarf wrapped around her arms and a headdress inlaid with pearls that sat lopsided over her short hair. Her sleeves extended far past her hands, nearly trailing to the floor. She stood with a lower posture than normal and Aang figured it was because this Toph hadn't dressed in anything like this in years. He couldn't read her expression, but the more he thought about it the more she seemed to resemble the way she did when Aang met her for the first time at the Beifong estate, or in his vision with the flying boar. Zuko kept fussing over his hair through his reflection, trying to ensure it stayed in his top knot, which Aang did a double take upon recognizing once he looked closer at it. He had Azula's crown in his hair, apparently borrowed from her for this occasion. His clothes looked the most familiar to Aang, a mantle in the Fire Nation style with pointed shoulders, all red and black and gold. He snapped to attention when Mai entered the room. Wow, Mai, you look nice. Her mouth twitched into a smile and he offered his arm, which she took as they marched out the door. Thank you, Zuko, she said. Well done, you remembered your courtesies. What's wrong, Toph? Aang asked, frowning. You look great. Her face softened for a moment but then settled back into unease. Thanks, Twinkletoes. This just isn't really my thing. What about me? Azula asked, her bottom lip protruding into a pout. Don't you have anything nice to say about my outfit? Of course I do. Aang said, his face getting warm as he looked her over. Azula had been given a crimson hanfu, blooming out at her waist with a golden dragon dancing along its folds from hem to chest. It had detached sleeves that matched the crimson and gold, leaving her shoulders bare. Embroidered designs depicting a rainbow of flames and flowers painted the sleeves, revealing a whole scene among its folds when she extended her arms. Her long hair had been woven into an elaborate headdress in the Earth Kingdom style which Aang assumed weighed down her whole head. You look great, he choked out, fixing his eyes on a blood-red orchid in the headdress. Well, it's a lot, we're all wearing a lot, but you both look amazing. Satisfied, she hooked her arm in Toph's. See, Toph? We managed to make the Avatar twist up his words, she said, sharing an amused glance with Aang. Let's just go and get this over with, Toph said. Aang let out a huff of air and took Toph's other arm, trying to force his blushes away with pure force of will. I agree. You're just being stubborn if you think we should stay. You're not thinking straight. I hate it when you do that. Do what? Point out your recklessness. No, just dismiss me and disrespect me as stubborn or irrational. You're unbelievable, after everything we've accomplished to get here you just want to get up and go. Suki, who had previously sat out of the argument with Gashiun, took that moment to step in. You two should really lower your voices, she urged. If our neighbors hear you the whole thing's going to be pointless anyway, and one's a cranky old lady even without knowing we're the enemy. Sokka clenched his fist but turned away and let out a deep breath. But 11 men disappearing? Unless they managed to get lost down there, it means some earthbenders found out about us and are trying to pick everyone off. They know, Katara. We have to leave. Don't you think they'd raise an alarm if they knew? That the whole city would be in an uproar. She retorted. The cramped apartment began to make her feel even more irritated. That would cause a panic, he shot back. Of course they wouldn't do that. And they wouldn't fight us directly because they have the advantage. They know those tunnels. That's not how Earth Kingdom soldiers fight, Katara said. I think you're just being a coward. She laced her voice with spite, striking where she knew it would hurt to get back at him for calling her irrational. He glared, and for a moment Katara had thought she managed to get him to back down, but he proved to be more stubborn than usual today. Okay, if it's not soldiers, then what? I told you. You thinks they're being taken by spirits. He scoffed. Even you're falling for her nonsense now. Hey, said Suki, interjecting again, if anyone would know about spirits it would be her. And that was how their bickering circled back and forth the whole day. Sokka and Katara argued with increasing intensity as Suki tried to play peacemaker and Gashiun stayed silent. Ultimately, it was Katara's decision because it was her mission, but when Sokka was finally willing to even consider the idea of spirits being the culprit, he urged her to turn back anyway, because that had the potential to be even worse. Katara wasn't sure how much she believed you to begin with. Even you admitted it was strange for so many spirits to inhabit an area below such an enormous city. But it didn't matter. She wasn't going to turn back now. I will never, ever turn my back on people who need me. She went out into the night by herself to cool her head, her whirlpool of thoughts making her feel dizzy. Katara had made it behind the city walls. She had traversed the maze of tunnels to get here, and now they could proceed with the original plan. Map out access points to the tunnels all across the city and coordinate for a combined attack, but for that she and Gashiun needed to find his sister Nagi and use her intelligence. She breathed in the warm night air, spreading her arms as she felt the moon's power flow through her, remembering her grandmother's teachings of moonlight flowing through her veins. Hamma's hoarse rasp that the moon was a crutch echoed in her other ear. Even when it wasn't full, it never left her, its power always there for the taking. Do you always come out to do breathing exercises by yourself at night in the middle of the road? Katara almost turned around with a wave of water pulled over her head, almost washed him away with it, but remembered where she was and stopped herself in time. She fixed her eyes on a boy with shaggy brown hair casually leaning against an empty fruit stand, a reed hanging between his lips. She hadn't noticed him before. Do you always sneak up on girls by themselves in the middle of the night? She asked, glowering. It's none of your business what I do. The boy removed the reed from his mouth and brushed its fronds between his fingers. Sorry about that. Honestly, I'm not really used to being able to sneak up on my friends at all. He stepped closer but still kept his distance, which was just fine to Katara. Let me start over. Hey, I'm Jet, and I'm an idiot for startling you. A mental image of actually assaulting him with a wave of water flashed through her mind. An intrusive thought just like the echo of a voice she heard sometimes, like a memory. June, she said. And yes, I'd say so. He shrugged, offering a crooked grin. Guess I deserved that one. He slouched and tilted his head, hooking his hands on his belt where she noticed a pair of blades he kept. He followed her line of sight. What brings you to Ba Sing Se, June? I'm a refugee, she said, keeping her voice measured. She considered blood-bending him into an alley and leaving him there, but something about him intrigued her. Just like everyone else. I don't think that's true, June, he said, stepping closer. Katara stood her ground. You don't have the same defeated look in your eye that everyone else does. I think you're a fighter. Maybe I'm just new at this. He put the reed back between his lips and she watched it bounce there as he spoke. No way. You're like me, June. Classic manipulation tactic. Repeated use of her name, slowly edging into her personal space, relating to her, distinguishing the two of them from everyone else, and giving her something to fixate on. He might not have even realized he did those things, but she was a master. All he was missing was the compliments. She hugged her arms to herself and looked away from him, trying to look small. But my eyes, they're blue, he said, finishing for her. And I think they're really pretty. But I can assume what happened, and they're not who you are, June. Lots of people have a similar story. There it is. Not bad. Thank you, she said, looking back at him. He shrugged. I'll let you get back to your breathing exercises. Sorry to bother you, June, but I'm sure I'll get the chance to make it up to you. He turned away, waving a hand in goodbye as he left. See you around. She watched him go, almost pitying him. Katara wondered if this was a game to Jet, if he often tried to manipulate people to his own ends. He was correct on one account, though. She was a fighter, so she pondered what he could need fighters for. Her anger at her brother had evaporated away only to be replaced by the riddle of the boy who seemed to think he could be as charismatic as she was. She could use that. Oh, a girl has her ways. Grand Secretariat Wu spread her arms wide, addressing all the guests in the grand hall with a sweeping gesture of her long, billowing sleeves. Welcome, everyone, as we celebrate the auspicious return of the Avatar to the world. Let us forget the worries of war for just a night as we partake in feasting, music, and dancing. A chorus of applause rose up and she turned to Aang. Avatar Aang, would you like to say a few words? His breath caught in his throat when she put him on the spot. Oh, let's not forget to be humble through all of this. Like the monks used to be. Wu smiled and Aang wasn't sure if his statement was lost on her. Eloquently put, Avatar, she said. Never refrain from showing gratitude for the simple things in life. Wise words. Now, enough talking, let the night of 100 revelries begin. She sat down on her cushion at Aang's right hand while he had the place of honor at the center of the table. Azula was at his left and Toph sat at her other side, with Zuko further down. The Council of Five, lacking only the stern General Muku this time, also occupied their table, along with a handful of ministers, sages, and dignitaries. Thankfully, Aang had his back to the wall, giving him a full view of the rest of the banquet hall that reminded him of the Earth King's throne room. The only person who had their own table was the Earth King, or rather, the puppet they placed behind a veil on his palanquin so only his shadow could be seen. He remained silent as Dai Li flanked him and well-wishers doted upon him while his silhouette occasionally made gestures at the people. Aang kind of wished they had a bear present, too, whether or not it was really Bosco. Dancers in elaborate costumes, elevated shoes, and heavy makeup performed in the center of the hall, bells jingling from their sleeves and hats and headdresses as they tossed bolts of silk like water and twirled among them. Some swayed with fans that made him think fondly of the Kyoshi warriors. Music resounded through the hall from a band that played in a far corner. He heard sounds from a tsunji horn, a bamboo flute, and a string instrument he didn't know the name of. Servants brought out several courses of meals through the evening, their feet light as spirits. Dishes soon covered the entire table and Aang had never seen so much food in his life. Roast turtle duck, seared salt tuna, pork, and vegetables simmered in a sauce that smelled tantalizingly of ginger. Sesame chicken pig sizzled in front of Azula which she politely dug into with Mai's lessons in mind. Another set of porcelain dishes and bowls held deer tail, soups, meat buns, and pastries he didn't recognize. Aang stuck with rice and vegetables and foods he knew. Toph, he noticed, barely picked at anything. Wu pulled back her silk sleeves and turned to Aang. Avatar, would you mind if I did a reading for you? A reading? He asked, placing his chopsticks back in their holder. Yes, she said. As you may remember, I was once a royal diviner for the king before becoming Grand Secretariat. And many years ago I used to be a simple fortune teller. I do remember, he said. And I don't mind. Wu smiled. Wonderful. Your hands, please. He held out his hands, palms up, and noticed General Fong eyeing them from the other side of the table. Their previous conversation where Aang had agreed to spy on Wu flashed through his mind. I don't think you'll be able to see more than an epic battle of life and death in my future, he said. I am supposed to fight the Water Emperor, after all. You may be surprised, she said, pursing her painted lips. She traced her forefinger along his palm. How curious, you have a strong lifeline, indicating vitality. But your headline is faded and split, as if you are caught between two major paths, two decisions that weigh on your mind. And it holds you back. Aang rolled his eyes, but she didn't notice. Only two. There are contradictions here. Despite your strong vitality, I see a life cut short, but it does not feel like yours. Death and doom, he said, his voice flat. Great. But how can you read someone else's fate on my palm? She frowned. I am not sure. I may have to consult the bones later. I have never read an avatar before. Perhaps the rules are different. Could be, he said. Her features softened. Do not be disheartened. If you lose hope for the future, then the people who look to you for guidance may lose it, too. He sighed. I know. I try every day to hold on to it. For him, Katara was that symbol of hope. But he didn't have her anymore. It's harder than it sounds, Wu said, smiling. But that is why we need to have nights like these. An opportunity for the people to forget the despair outside these walls. I know you frown upon the extravagance here, but the enemy outside isn't the only thing we fight to keep away. She leaned in closer to him, her voice dropping. We live in constant paranoia, you know, various groups vie for power here in the city. The Council of Five fears the Siwang Desert and the Sandbender tribe's growing influence. I worry over the creeping crystal. And we are both concerned for the day when the Water Nation will make their move, or when Longfeng retaliates in revenge. Not to mention, other societies. What do you mean? He asked. Who are they? He had never heard of the creeping crystal. Was that a proverb, a code, or something else? Now is not the time for that discussion, she said, and he suspected Fong had been trying to listen, even as he spoke with one of the sages. But, as I said, the people need this. I guess you have a point, he admitted, folding his hands in his lap. Though I'm sure there are other ways to hold on to hope, too. He was starting to feel like he was in over his head. There was too much he didn't know and it frustrated him. Maybe so, Wu replied. But this is what the people know. They need a symbol and you could fill that role, and I must admit, I had hoped you would shave your head for tonight to show off those arrows of yours. She chuckled into her sleeve. I can't be just a symbol, he said, glancing toward the Shadow King behind his veils. I have to fight. Not for this night, at least, she told him, turning back to her food. Relax. Mingle with the sages and the nobles and the generals you haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. She gestured to a man with an impressive white beard who had been introduced to him earlier as General Yoganjin, neatly pecking at his food with chopsticks. Next to him sat a burly woman, General Zhu Zhang, who ripped into a boar pig leg with her bare hands. Aang had a feeling he had met them in his world but couldn't place them. He was saved from a response when Azula put a hand on his arm. My legs are beginning to fall asleep, she said, leaning in. Let's go dance. Aang stood with her at once. Okay. He bowed to Wu. Thank you for the reading, Aunt Wu. The overly familiar address escaped his lips before he could stop it, but the Grand Secretariat didn't seem to mind. He was so glad to be saved from the prospect of mingling with people that he didn't even register the fact that Azula had asked him to dance. By this point, the professional dancers had gone. Azula turned to him once they reached the dance floor and lowered into a curtsy, spreading her arm out as if to display the work of art on her sleeve. I'm beginning to get bored, she said. This party isn't really what I had expected. Mai is still off doing her thing, isn't she? I'm thinking of going to join her. Sorry, he said, because he didn't know what else to say. Can you, even dance? I can't imagine it's that difficult, she replied, giving him a haughty smirk. She began by imitating a slower version of what the dancers had done earlier, gesturing and weaving and ducking behind her sleeves. He tried to follow, but he felt stiff and awkward. As they continued and she noticed his discomfort, she frowned and accidentally stepped on his foot. All right. I suppose I stand corrected. I have a better idea, he said, and a wonderful memory bloomed in his mind of a different dance in a cave with a crowd of people watching him and Katara, so long ago. Follow my lead. He stepped forward into a jab, circling his arms back into a stance and circling around her. She smirked, sliding into the forms for the dancing dragon, but they moved faster than the standard as the band's tempo picked up and they skipped the last step to cycle again and again, locking eyes throughout the forms. Aang felt heat circling between the two, their faces flushed, as more and more people stood to watch them, clapping along with the music. They leapt and ducked and laughed when her head dress went askew, but Azula didn't bother to fix it as they continued through the forms. At last, they ended it in the final form, with bodies bent and fingers touching to form a circle with their arms. They faced each other, panting, and for a moment their fingers did more than brush against each other until Aang ended the dance with a formal bow. Azula looked at him with a smile and half-lidded eyes, sweat beading on her brow, and returned the formality. Azula adjusted her head dress, but it was for naught because her hair had fallen out of place, not that she seemed to mind. Well, that was fun. It was, he agreed. From experience, water-bending forms are probably more suited to dancing, he admitted. But the dancing dragon worked great. Water-bending, she said, and her face fell. So you got that idea from Katara, didn't you? He frowned. Well, we did that once. What's wrong? I need some air. She turned away without another word, pushing through the revelers and ignoring his shouts to come back. Zuko felt so out of place sitting at the table with sages and ministers who discussed matters wholly unrelated to him that he mostly sat in silence. At one point, he tried bringing up the subject of the war with General Falan, but the man simply curled his long mustache in his finger and returned to a conversation about the military budget with the Minister of Coin. He felt a glimmer of hope when the uptight General Yoganjin tried for some polite small talk with Zuko and asked how he knew the Avatar. Before Zuko could reply, General Zhujiang made a comment about how Yo had gotten some sauce on his pristine white sleeves and he glared at her in distaste before excusing himself to clean it up. Toph was no help, either. Most of the other people at their table gave her a wide berth after she told off one of the sages when he offered her a dumpling. Zuko was glad Mai hadn't been there to see that outburst. So you're not going to eat? He asked her, pushing a half-eaten pork cutlet around his own plate. Her response came out in a low mutter. How can these people eat like this when so many others are starving outside the walls? It's not fair, he agreed. But we're not like them. Wanna know the crazy thing? She asked him, tilting her head in his direction. I was. When I was really little. So much that, if my parents were still alive and escaped from our home, they could have probably been right here. At this very party. Zuko pictured the sight of his own mother, her body floating just under the surface of the water. Her eyes closed as if sleeping, her favorite flowers splayed all around her when they spilled out of her basket. Yeah, he said. It's hard to think about what could have been. I wonder if this is where I would have met you guys for the first time instead, she said. If my parents had managed to drag me to this party. She lowered her voice even further, barely more than a whisper. Since coming here. I've wondered why that happened. Why Jailing fell. Did the Council of Five abandon them, just like everything else outside their walls? Zuko furrowed his brow. You can't think like that. My uncle always said we can't let ourselves get lost in what we cannot change and focus on what we can. Toph uncrossed her arms. You're close with your uncle, huh? You talk about him a lot. Heh. Closer to him than I am with my father. Always was. She smiled. Well, one day, I hope I get the chance to meet him. By the time he escaped the crowd, warding off requests and questions and well wishes, Azula had managed to lose Aang. He wandered out into the palace halls, empty except for the occasional guard or drunken party-goer. He wondered briefly if the Roku warriors had managed to avoid the Dai Li in their reconnaissance around the palace, but pushed the thought from his mind when he thought he saw Azula far at the end of the hall, but it was a different woman. His stomach fell. He had hurt her. He didn't know how or why, but he knew he had to fix it. His search had brought him out to the palace courtyard, past a sculpture of an ancient queen and topiaries of badger moles and bears. He found the king's gardens here, a maze of painstakingly maintained waist-high hedges and brick paths, ponds and streams and waterfalls, paper lanterns lighting the way in a rainbow of flowers. On the far side of the garden he found a flowering plum tree by a pond, its gnarled roots clinging to the earth littered by its petals. Azula sat upon them, her dress pooled around her, and for a moment he thought she was fire bending sparks through the air until he realized they were fireflies. Her headdress had been discarded and her hair fell loose and free. Aang approached on hesitant feet. "Azula, are you okay?" She had her back to him. "Go away, Aang. I want to know what I did wrong." He sat down cross-legged by the pond and peered at her with concern, noticing that she had wiped all of her makeup onto her sleeve. The distant sounds of chattering and the party had faded far behind them. She scoffed. "Nothing you can change, so don't worry. Just tell me. Let me try." He frowned. "Everything seemed fine when we were dancing." "For you, maybe," she said. "You weren't dancing with me. You were somewhere else the whole time, weren't you?" "What are you talking about? I was right there with you." He leaned toward her, his face twisted in disbelief. She still avoided looking at him. "Maybe, but you can't share moments that you had with her and replay them with me. I'm not Katara. I'm not a replacement for her." He reached out his hand to grasp her shoulder in a comforting gesture but stopped himself halfway. Azula couldn't replace Katara. No one could. I don't think that. I never intended that. Katara is. I know," she cut him off, her voice sharp. She finally looked him in the eye. "You love her. You've said it before and you don't need to say it again." He put his hands back in his lap and looked down at them. "Well, then I don't know what to say. You've been acting so strange ever since I told you my secret." His eyes widened and he looked at her again. "It's that spirit. It has to be. Azula, I've got to do something about it. You can't keep living with that." There'd been so little time, too much happening to really focus on a way to handle that. Guilt gnawed at him for letting the issue sit for as long as he did. "It's not a spirit," she said, her voice maintaining its edge. "She isn't a spirit. Do you want to know what you've been blind to, all this time? It's your Princess Azula. The murderer. The monster." He turned to her, on his knees, mouth dropped open in shock. The amber in her eyes almost seemed to shine with something wild that he noticed before and somehow overlooked, and he knew it to be true, the certainty of it ringing in his head with such strength that he couldn't believe he didn't consider the possibility before. He looked at Azula from head to toe, as if finally noticing her for the first time, as if she would morph and change into the young woman who had killed so many people he cared about right then and there. He tried to reach out and touch her but recoiled like she was contaminated. "But, how? I don't know how, or why. It must be the merging." Her voice sounded higher, strained, and she flexed her fingers. "But I've felt her for weeks now. Clawing at me. Burning the back of my eyes, fighting and screaming and laughing and whispering. Trying to get out. Trying to hurt you. Trying to hurt Zuko. And she's getting stronger and it's been harder and harder to hold her back." She looked him straight on again and he saw so much vulnerability and so much pain behind her glistening eyes. At that moment he hated himself for recoiling away from her as if she had burned him, and he grasped both her hands, his eyes fixed on hers. "I'm going to fix this, Azula. You don't have to do this alone. You're not like her. And you're so strong for being able to fight her off as long as you have been." Her tears fell, sliding down her cheek, but she locked her fingers with his instead of pulling away. A ring of fireflies hovered around her head like a crown. "One thing has worked so far, helped me keep her away." She let out a breath, her shoulders falling. "It's thinking about you. Thinking about how much I love you." She smiled, then, and the tension left her eyes and he knew without a doubt that she spoke the truth. He dropped his hands and looked away from her, his gaze falling on a plum that had fallen by her feet. Emotions whirled inside of him that he couldn't identify and words failed him. "You don't need to say anything," she said, her eyes downcast. She rolled a plum blossom between her fingers which smoked and fell in cinders. "I know you don't feel the same way. You never will. I've accepted that a while ago, I think even before I knew how I felt for myself. Azula, He got cut off when he sensed a light vibration through his earthbending and turned to see one of the Roku warriors in a three-point landing behind him, a cloth mask over her mouth and nose. "Avatar Aang," she said, head bowed. Mai wants you to see something. Follow me. He exchanged a glance with Azula, who nodded and wiped her eyes. I'm coming, she said. He nodded in return and followed after the Roku warrior, keeping to the shadows and avoiding any people they came across, especially Dai. He weighed Azula's confession in his mind, repeating the memory over and over again. The fear and the desperation and the hope in her eyes refused to leave him, making him sick with guilt. The warrior led them outside the palace and to a pagoda within the palace gates, the moon looming over it and casting silver light that made Aang feel exposed to anyone who might be looking outside the palace windows. He spotted Mai on one of the tiered roofs, almost indistinguishable in the shadows. I will stand guard out here, Mai's warrior said. I suppose I will, too, said Azula. She rolled her eyes in vague annoyance, but gestured up to Mai. What are you waiting for? Jump up there with Mai. Are you? I'm fine, she said in a harsh whisper. Go. He nodded and leapt, his robes fanning out as the winds carried him up to where Mai waited for him outside a shuttered window. This is Wu's residence, she said. Her private study is through this window. And the Dai? He asked. Some are downstairs, she replied. Most are patrolling the palace. We have to be quick. He nodded and she opened the window, sliding in without a sound. He followed right behind her into a room lit by dim lanterns and heavy with an acrid smell of incense. Wu's study was surprisingly small, crowded with bookshelves and strange astrological instruments and star charts. He saw a pile of bones that he knew from experience she used for divination. He and Mai shuffled through the documents she kept in an orderly pile, reports from various ministries and businesses throughout the city. He found a scroll next to a brass bell that explained the basics of directional geomancy, a journal she used for cloud reading, and an open book titled The Four Auspices. They dug through drawers and Aang started to feel like they would find nothing useful, nothing to determine where her allegiances lay, or anything about the Council of Five or King Bumi, when his fingers brushed against a wooden tile. A white lotus pie showpiece. He picked it up and examined it. Could Wu be a member too? Was this something Kun Na and Piandao had kept from him? Did this hint at a connection to Bumi, if he was also a member? He was about to point it out to Mai when the Roku warrior that had led them there appeared in the window. Quickly, she said. We must depart. The Grand Secretariat is returning. Already? Mai asked. But she should still be at the party. She turned to Aang. Ugh. Inconvenient, but we have to go. Aang clenched the white lotus piece in his palm. No, he said. I'm tired of everyone's secrets. I need to know. Mai buried her face in her hand and shook her head. Fine. They had waited for scarcely a minute when a pair of Dai agents came into the room, eyes wide with the surprise of seeing Aang and Mai there. They held out their fists. What are you doing here? One of them asked. What's going on? Wu's voice called out from the hall. She appeared between the two agents a moment later, her hair in disarray. Avatar Aang. I've been looking all over for you, what are you doing in my private quarters? I found this, he said, holding out the lotus piece. Tell me, are you a member of the White Lotus Society? She put a hand on her chest. The White Lotus Society? Those insurrectionists? Heavens, no. Aang lowered his arm, faltering. Insurrectionists? I've been investigating them for many moons now, she said. The White Lotus, the Creeping Crystal, all of it. She narrowed her eyes at him and Mai. Are you allied with them? Is this attack you're doing? Aang's heart spiked. Attack? What attack? Wu flailed, her sleeves flapping as she gestured to the palace through the window. The assault on the palace. He and Mai locked eyes. Zuko and Toph are still there. Aang exclaimed. We have to go and help. The questions that flooded his mind fell away. Now was the time for action. It's not the Water Nation. Wu shook her head. There are no waterbenders. But they're already holding hostages within the banquet hall. He would have leapt out of the window right then and there, but he didn't have his glider, so he turned to Mai again. We need a plan. A sneak attack, she said. I am sure my warriors are fighting, but we'll need to coordinate with the Dai. She looked at Wu, who nodded after a moment of hesitation, apparently accepting that they were not the culprits. Come on, we have no time to waste. Zuko was glad to be a firebender now, but nothing could beat a good pair of swords. Toph had sensed their assailants coming before they had struck, raising an alarm that allowed them to fight back before getting overwhelmed. They didn't have enough time to get all of the guests to safety. Most had gathered together in the center of the banquet hall, with Toph, and Zuko and the generals and the Dai Li forming a defense around them. The attackers all wore nondescript brown clothes and hoods, some used earthbending and others used conventional weaponry, which was where Zuko had pilfered twin blades after disarming the assailant with firebending. Generals Fong and Falan tried to keep order among the panicked masses, especially since Wu managed to escape with some of her Dai Li in the initial confusion and another circle of Dai Li escorted the fake king to safety. General Zhujiang punched a fist into her palm. I'm not sitting around here and waiting for them to close in. I say we go on the attack. We need a plan, General Yoganjin urged. Both he and Zhu were non-benders, so they gave the orders while Fong and Falan worked on the defenses. These insurrectionists will rue the day they've attacked us while we're all together. I don't know, Zuko said. He pointed at Toph, who had already gone ahead and wiped the floor with a dozen of them. My friend is fighting a lot more than you guys are. Zuko stood with his blades crossed in front of him, shooting blasts of fire at any foes that came near the panicked party guests. His robes didn't give him much mobility. I like her spirit. Zhujiang exclaimed, and she lifted a whole table in her muscular arms and hurled it into the fray, leaping after the assailants with her bare hands. We need to get these people out of here, Zuko said to the three generals left. Another Dai Li agent, a young woman in a cowl she wore under her conical hat with a thick, black braid over her shoulder, stepped forward with rock gloves covering her fists. They can escape through the palace's lower levels, she informed them, opening up a hole in the floor. They should be safe. We don't know if these insurrectionists have infiltrated those parts of the palace, Fong said. Someone hurled a huge boulder above their defenses that Falan managed to break before it hit anyone. I do believe that is the safest course of action for them right now, he said. Everyone, go below. General Yoganjin led the way. Zuko helped shepherd the people underground, eager to join Toph so they could split and search for Aang, Azula, and Mai. He caught signs of other Roku warriors fighting, discarded needles and knives that had pinned their targets to various surfaces, but had no idea where his friends could have gone. As soon as he confirmed that the generals had the situation with the party guests under control, he ran to Toph's side, taking out an ambusher with a stream of fire before he could attack her. You okay, Toph? He asked, standing back to back with her. Despite her long dress and sleeves, she seemed none the worse for wear, throwing a backhanded blow that ripped up a pillar of stone and launched an enemy far away from them. You know it, she said. Zuko caught an enemy's spear between his blades and disarmed the man, and immediately turned to strike another when someone so huge he thought they were Zhujiang appeared and smacked his assailant out of the way with an enormous log. A little boy leapt off of the newcomer's shoulders, jabbing at anyone he could reach with his spear. Zuko recognized them with a start, but Toph was the one who exclaimed their names. Pipsqueak. The Duke. What are you guys doing here? Aang found himself thankful for the sheer number of pillars lining the palace halls as they made their way toward their destination. He, Azula, and Mai crept by the palace assailants unnoticed, fighting only when they had to so they could avoid detection. Aang tried to get a good look at them as they passed, but couldn't identify any of the attackers or their affiliations. They could have been anything, but Wu's words about the White Lotus being insurrectionists echoed in his mind. Kunna had said she was fairly new to the society herself. How much could she really know about it? What about Piandao? Even though the organization had the same name in his world, he couldn't rule out the possibility that they'd have very different goals. They had split off from Wu and her Dai Li, planning to encircle the banquet hall from both of its entrances and cut off the assailants there. When they reached the south entrance, their target, Aang launched himself forward in a corkscrew motion, the air circling around him, and hit a group of them right where they had gathered tightest, bowling over several of the assailants. His robes almost caught on his legs, but he managed to right himself just in time to duck under an earthbender's blow and retaliate with an arc of fire that Azula added to right behind him when she jumped into the fray. Aang used earthbending to trap as many of them as he could, hoping to question them later, but more enemy earthbenders came. Their motions were oddly quick and precise, light-footed, and familiar, and it struck Aang suddenly that they fought just like Dai Li. "Who are you people?" he asked them, but none deigned to answer. More enemies came to fill their ranks and Aang wondered where they had all come from. It seemed as if they had been in the palace all along and his mind raced with the implications. Just as the three of them seemed to be on the verge of being overwhelmed, a rain of arrows whistled through the air and pinned several of the assailants to the walls, while another quick figure darted into the battle with knives in her hands. A third figure followed right after them, hooking his swords around the ankles of one of the assailants and flipping him up to land on his face, taking out another by launching himself forward with a kick. Aang recognized their rescuers at once. Longshot, Smellerbee, and Jet. He realized he shouldn't have been surprised. "What are you doing here?" Azula asked them, wiping her hands once their enemies were taken care of. Her tone of voice indicated no surprise or anger, just curiosity. "We came to save you, of course," Jet said, removing his reed from his lips with an easygoing grin. "And don't worry, the freedom fighters are riding with a group called the Creeping Crystal now. Your friends are safe." That name again. How many of this game's players had converged tonight? And now what? Aang asked, on guard. He wanted to trust Jet, truly, he did, but he didn't know if this Jet had been through the same experiences as the other Jet in Ba Sing Se. Jet rested one of his hooked blades on his shoulder. "Come with us and you'll see." Chapter 17, Lake Laogai. Any news? Zuko traipsed up onto Appa's tail just as the bison heaved himself into the sky, carefully balancing until he reached the saddle and sat down among his friends. "Yes," Zuko said, but Aang didn't like the somber look on his face. "Big news. A rebellion formed to take back Ba Sing Se." "What?" Katara exclaimed. "Isn't that good news? How come we haven't heard anything about that? We're pretty close to the city now." "They lost," Sokka stated. He didn't even look up from polishing his sword. "Didn't they?" Zuko brushed his hair out of his eyes. "They were crushed. Completely. No survivors, according to this report." He held up the documents he had stolen from an encampment and Aang could see half of the Fire Nation insignia on the wax seal. Toph fidgeted with her meteorite bracelet, a habit she had developed for all the time they spent in the air. "Anyone we know die there?" She spoke with a tone so casual she could have been asking about the weather. It was easier that way. "Yeah. Well, you guys knew him, anyway," Zuko said. "The Earth King. He was the one who led it, rallied up all those people. It mentions his bear, too." "Who would have guessed?" Sokka remarked. He still didn't look up from his sword. "Never would have thought he'd have it in him." "Took him 2 years, Toph said." The bracelet snaked around her fingers. "Wonder what he'd been doing all that time. I figured he just stayed in hiding." "He could have come to us for help," Aang said, his arms crossed. He ignored Momo's attempts to play with him and the lemur flew to Katara's shoulder instead. "Sent word to us somehow. Maybe things could have been different." He couldn't muster the energy to feel strongly about Ki's loss. It was a shame, no doubt, and he wished he could have done better, but they had already lost so much. The ache was a familiar one. "We can't think like that," Katara said, but Aang knew her well enough by now to know that she was the one who thought that way the most, who yearned for what could have been. She sniffed the air and then grimaced. "I smell something burning." Sokka finally looked up, glancing around for the sight of smoke, but the sky had been clear and blue the whole day. "Ash." "No," Zuko said, drawing 2 fingers to his scar. "I know that smell. That's not ash." The fighting ended as abruptly as it had begun. Jet spirited them away into tunnels beneath the palace while his freedom fighters stayed behind to cause a distraction. An earthbender who worked alongside Jet, a man who was very much an adult, led the way, carving a path for them and digging deeper and deeper below the palace. Burning curiosity propelled Aang forward as chaos ensued overhead and he felt more and more like things had been ripped out of his control. He still didn't know if the creeping crystal could be friend or foe, if Jet might be leading Aang, Azula, and Mai into a trap, who the palace raiders could even be or what they had intended to do. He didn't know where Zuko and Toph could be, either. Aang had to take Jet's word that they were safe and they'd meet at a rendezvous point. After their ensemble escaped below the palace, everyone else seemed to as well. The attackers scattered using the very same tunnels, intersecting only occasionally with Aang's group where they had easily fought them off. Dai Li combed the tunnels as well in pursuit of the attackers, which Jet and the creeping crystal earthbender avoided because they said this was to be a secret mission and the Grand Secretariat viewed them as an enemy. Aang felt like they were ferret mice scurrying in their burrows, unsure of what they'd find behind every bend and descent. Longshot and Smellerbee will be fine, Jet said, as if assuring himself. They'll get out of the palace too. And Zuko and Bandit are with Pipsqueak and the Duke. They're not far now. Assuming Toph even went along with them, Azula pointed out, her blue flames giving them an eerie light to show them the way. I'm sure you remember what happened when we all first met. Her snide remark seemed to have no effect on Jet. They had no other choice but to get out of there with my gang, Jet said as they paused so the earthbender could map out their route. He smirked at Azula. Aren't you glad we came to rescue you? Aang was glad to see Azula roll her eyes. You don't know Toph as well as you seem to think you do, Aang said. She'd make a new choice if there were no others, always. You kids keep it down, the earthbender shushed, pressing his back against the tunnel wall. He dropped his voice to a whisper, his bristly white mustache quivering. Someone's coming. I think Dai Li again. Aang thought back to the palace assailants and the way he noticed they had fought. Like Dai Li, shooting small stones to grapple and restrain. Quick and precise. The floor fell out from under them. Aang saw a sudden brightness before he realized they fell through open air, the ground far below them, they had fallen into a cavern. Aqueducts flowed by far beneath them and he hurried to pull at the water with his limited bending knowledge and slow their fall with a gust of air, catching Jet and Mai in the stream. Azula caught herself on jets of flame and lowered gracefully to the floor while the earthbender guide softened his landing with a shockwave. Thanks, Mai said, holding out her waterlogged sleeves with a grimace. Aang grasped the water and dried her, looking around at the cavern where they'd found themselves. The brightness he had seen was green crystal, they'd arrived at the catacombs. He felt a chill go up his spine. The memory of his own death flooded back to him. Sorry, folks, the earthbender guide said. Aang looked up at where they had fallen from and noticed the earthbender had managed to seal the hole as they fell before the Dai Li had seen them. I just expected there to be another tunnel under us. We're further along than I thought. That's fine, Jet said. Let's keep moving. Azula smoothed out the folds in her dress. Can't you tell us anything yet? Not yet, Jet replied, running ahead with the guide. Aang shook his head to clear the fog, the memory of death and betrayals enlightening. The memory of the last time he had been able to access the Avatar state in his world. They continued without incident from then on, following a labyrinth of passages that only Jet and the guide seemed to know. They passed no Dai Li nor the still unknown assailants, but they did find a few other members of the Creeping Crystal, fighters and earthbenders who operated with professional efficiency. Aang observed that they backtracked, wound around different and roundabout paths, and tread certain passages multiple times, perhaps in an effort to conceal their destination or shake off any pursuers. The earthbenders rarely carved their own tunnels, instead, they just opened up paths to existing ones. The tunnels began to ascend again after what felt like hours later, high enough that tree roots soon began to pierce the earth above them and crisscross in a web over their heads. Soon after, the air started to feel damp, droplets of water dripping onto their heads. Aang's formal robes felt soiled by dirt and battle, but he didn't want to shed the outer robe yet and leave it behind for someone to track him. The guide broke through a final wall into a series of interconnected chambers and recognition flashed into Aang's mind at once. He knew the high, cavernous hollows interlocked with layers of brick and rounded tunnels, branching off into multiple holding cells, a vestige of this place's history as a prison, lit by the ominous glow of lanterns lining the edges of the floors. They were underneath Lake Laogai. Aang took a fighting stance and faced the earthbender guide and he was glad to see Azula and Mai trusted him enough to follow his lead. You took us to Lake Laogai, he said, eyes narrowed. The secret headquarters of the Dai Li, this must be a trap. The guide put up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Whoa, there. I did no such thing, this is the headquarters of the Creeping Crystal. Jet crossed his arms, unfazed by Azula aiming her fists at him. This is the thanks we get for bringing you to safety? We don't know where the Daily keep their headquarters, but it isn't here. You expect us to trust you? Azula asked, eyes narrowed. I told you, I've turned over a new leaf, he said. Me and my freedom fighters came to Ba Sing Se to help in the war effort. You guys inspired us to make a real difference, but we found ourselves among these guys. He regarded her with a raised eyebrow. And that's pretty rich, coming from you. If I remember correctly, you had no problem going along with my plan to blow up that town. Wasn't that long ago, was it? Azula seemed ready to snarl a response, but Zuko and Toph rounded a corner. The sight of them unharmed hardened Aang, and he straightened his stance. Both still wore their formal clothing as well, though Toph's pale green hanfu had even more dirt on it than Aang's robes, and she had lost her head dress just like Azula. Zuko rushed over to Mai's side, grinning. Hey, you're all okay? Toph had apparently sensed Jet and kept her distance. Jet, for his part, said nothing, and averted his gaze from her. Aang didn't know yet what to make of this new Jet who had joined a different resistance group, but he supposed it depended on what sort of group they were. We don't normally operate so close to the palace grounds, the guide said. Or even the city. But we caught wind of an attack and had to go help. Besides, we knew you were there. Azula plucked the pin out of her headpiece that Zuko currently wore and pulled her hair up into a partial topknot, putting her headpiece back in its rightful place. He tried to protest, but she stuck her tongue out at him and then turned to the guide. So you've been spying on us, have you? Our leaders have been very interested in the Avatar's actions and whereabouts, the guide continued. We'll bring you to them. This is where I leave you guys, Jet said, heading off for one of the divergent tunnels. For now. I've gotta find my gang. Toph let out a sigh as he departed. Are you okay, Toph? Zuko asked, brow furrowed in concern. You know what? She said. I'll catch up with you guys later. She ran off after Jet, leaving Aang, Zuko, Azula, and Mai looking at each other with non-committal shrugs. Aang pushed that worry from his mind. He had too many other concerns right now, and he trusted Toph to make the right decisions. They passed by several old holding cells, many of which seemed to be converted to temporary living quarters for small families that Aang assumed to be refugees. Barrels and crates of supplies filled other rooms, locked behind metal bars. The Creeping Crystal headquarters bustled with activity even outside the cells as people swarmed past their group in a general state of unrest. The guide explained that many of them were earthbenders who worked around the clock to ensure all the tunnels leading to Lake Laogai constantly changed. As far as the Daily and Council of Five were concerned, this underground prison had been collapsed and flooded a century ago. Aang knew that the Daily also used the secret network of tunnels beneath the palace to make their way around the city, so if the Creeping Crystal also managed that without attracting much notice, then the breadth and depth of the catacombs seemed much more expansive than he had previously thought. The guide left them at a plain metal door and said the Creeping Crystal's leaders were just through it. Aang pulled open the door, its hinges screeching in protest, and found himself in the widest chamber yet beneath Lake Laogai. His eyes passed over the chains and shackles hanging from the ceiling, falling on the war table in the center of the chamber where a handful of men and women sat. Most noticeable of the occupants was a brown bear and a goat gorilla resting together, but after them Aang's gaze fell on an ancient man with a two-pronged feathered hat and fur-lined brown robes. The old man turned to face him and spread his arms wide. You must be the Avatar, he said. Welcome, welcome. Aang responded by running up to the former king and throwing his arms around him in a hug, burying his face in the man's robes. He was the same as ever and his heart swelled with fondness and relief. Bumi, you mad genius. It's good to see you again. The old king put his hands back in surprise for a moment but returned the embrace. You know it's me? Oh, you ruined my fun, I'd hoped to play a trick. He chuckled, his snorts giving Aang an ache and longing for his childhood when everything was different. Aang, I've missed you. And I always thought you were naturally bald. Toph followed Jet, unsure of what she would say or what she would do and thinking that it probably would have been better to just ignore his presence. But she couldn't. She wasn't ready to see him again so soon after his betrayal, but she knew she had to do something. He stopped in a deserted corridor, keeping his back to her. I know now that I went too far with what I tried to do, he said. And I messed up. But I'm gonna fix it now by doing some real good, here with the creeping crystal. She clenched her fists. How do I know you're telling the truth? He turned around to face her. What do you mean? Of course you know. You always know when someone's lying. Do I? She retorted, voice laced with anger. You manipulated me all that time. Kept secrets from me. Used me. And I am no one's tool. Somehow, he had been able to beat her lie detection. The fact that he had been able to deceive her and she didn't know how frustrated her the most. That's not true, he said. I didn't know how to tell you. You were always my number two. No, my partner. My equal. She pointed a finger at him. Don't insult me like that. I'm better than you. I never wanted to hurt innocent people. You just tried to keep me around as your muscle all that time. His posture leaned forward, his arms pumping as he tried to argue with her. No way. Come on, bandit. I made some mistakes but now I'm trying to make things better. You gotta give me that chance. Smellerby, Longshot, and all the rest, they all miss you. We want you back, bandit. She turned away from him, walking back to where Aang and the others had gone. I've got a different calling now, she said. I'm doing some real fighting against the Empire. Training Aang so he can beat the big bads. So no, I'm never gonna join up with the freedom fighters ever again. She took a deep breath, trying to settle her own surging heart rate. And it's not bandit anymore. My name is Toph. His shoulders fell and he said nothing more as she departed. Bumi released all of his soldiers so he could talk privately to Aang and the others, along with the other person who led the creeping crystal alongside him, the former Earth King, Ki. Ki was significantly more muscular than Aang had remembered, accentuated by his layers of armor and shoulder pads. Otherwise, he wore a green velvet hat with a tassel and his spectacles that remained as always. An enormous warhammer rested in easy reach, with Bosco the bear and Flopsy the goat gorilla playing with each other beyond that. They all sat down together at the table that reminded Aang of the one in the Council of Five's war chamber, though this one was more crudely carved from earth. After introductions had been made, Zuko and Azula fired off with the questions that had been brimming in their minds. But now that Aang knew Bumi was alive and safe, he wanted to push aside all of his worries for a little while, to free himself of the weight of the unknown, to just run and laugh and play pranks with his oldest friend. Mai leaned forward to catch Aang's gaze. Aang, focus, she said. You're daydreaming about something. He had been staring ahead at Flopsy and Bosco, but looked back to Mai with a sigh gloomy enough to match one of hers. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. Do you know who attacked the palace? Zuko asked. I have my suspicions, but... Bumi peered at him with one eye narrowed and the other opened wide. Suspicions, Might you share some of them, just to see if we're all on the same page? The Daily, Zuko responded. Attacking themselves. I don't know why, but there's so much distrust in the city that someone must be trying to manipulate things. Aang nodded in agreement. He had a similar thought, and was glad to see Zuko shared that. You're a sharp boy, Bumi said. But you aren't thinking it through enough. Consider more of the possibilities. You're partially right, Ki explained. We captured some and haven't been able to interrogate them fully, but we believe Long Feng is the culprit, all the way from Jiduan. His city in the Fire Nation. He scowled and clenched his fists. He took some of his agents with him when he fled from here 5 years ago. Aang frowned. What could he want? Is he trying to take back Ba Sing Se? Perhaps indirectly, said Ki. He shouldn't know that I stepped down, but he likely has spies under Grand Secretariat Wu passing information along to him. I don't know about that, Azula said, tapping her lips. We met him months ago and he asked us to assassinate you. So unless he learned otherwise relatively recently, he still thinks you are the king. Ki steepled his fingers and gazed over the table, which held a map of the city and the surrounding area. Is that so? Well, either way, he must suspect it. I think he attacked the welcoming feast because he assumed I was there and planned to assassinate me or expose the false king to the world. Well, why don't you just expose yourself? Azula said, but her face reddened in a most un-Azula-like way and she stammered while Zuko and Bumi barked out in laughter. Well, that came out wrong. You know what I mean. The animals perked up when they heard, heads tilted in confusion. Mai simply yawned. Kai's face flushed in embarrassment and he took off his glasses to wipe them clean. Well, indeed. He put his spectacles back on his nose, cleared his throat, and put on a straight face. If we did that, the people may think I am just a pretender king at this point, and I would be unable to do what I have been doing here. This allows me more freedom to do what I can to help in the war effort in a more direct way. As a king, I was nothing more than a puppet who danced in ignorance until Bumi came here and told me the truth. Azula pursed her lips. Well, what have you been doing? You're both kings. You could have all the power, but instead you're here floundering about underground. You could go back and rule and make all the decisions you want whether your subjects like it or not. And that includes the Council of Five, Wu, the ministries, all of them. It's not so simple, Bumi said. Kai made the right choice to step out of that complex web. Instead, he is here to wait and listen for the right moment to strike so this city doesn't fall to the same fate as Omashu. Have you seen Omashu? Now it's Omashed up. He snorted in laughter that no one else shared. Oh, I know, I probably shouldn't make light of it but I couldn't resist. Don't worry, much of the tragedy was averted. Many of my people live in Ba Sing Se now, or in the mountains outside of the city. The creeping crystal does a lot of work to settle as many refugees as possible, Kai said once Bumi had settled down. We sneak them into the city or settle them in the mountains, like Bumi said. Long ago there used to be a town claimed by the Daophii, or outlaw groups, out there, but it has since been abandoned so we moved them in. We fight to protect them from the Water Nation but also work to mitigate some extreme measures taken by the Council of Five. And recently we've begun to coordinate with other independent groups against the Water Nation, like your friends the Freedom Fighters. Extreme measures taken by the Council? Zuko asked. Like what? That is some exposition for another time. Bumi said, standing up. Your Roku warrior friend seems very bored and frankly I am, too. Thanks, Mai said, but Aang wasn't sure if she was being sarcastic or not. You kids need to get back to the palace before everyone gets suspicious, Bumi said. And your nice fancy clothes are really dirty. I want to go back for Appa and Sabi, Aang said. He felt nervous enough leaving them alone for that long. But after that, we have no reason to stay anymore. We'll come back here. I'm not so sure if you should, Kai said. We could use their help to plan an invasion. We'd need as big of a force as we can. We tried to get them to help, but they wouldn't, Zuko said. They're just focused on defending rather than attacking. We even found out about an eclipse where waterbenders would lose their power but they said it would be useless. Maybe so, Bumi said. It's been done, the Water Nation knows to expect an attack during the eclipses over the years. But we can plan one for any old day. They might just expect it less. As long as it's before the second moon comes, Aang said, and he thought of Sozin's comet blazing across an orange sky. He considered the merits of the idea. Before they unleash complete devastation. Bumi looked at him with something Aang couldn't determine, but then shrugged. Yes, of course. We would distract them enough for you to sneak on in and defeat the Water Emperor. Can we trust Wu? Aang asked. And the Council of Five? At least long enough to plan the invasion. The Council likes their power, Kai said. And their security. I fear they view Wu as weak and undeserving of her position. He adjusted his glasses. And Wu is a paranoid woman, seeing enemies in every shadow. I got that impression of Wu, Aang admitted. He remembered what she said about the White Lotus being a group of insurrectionists. Honestly, she has every right to be suspicious, Kai admitted. Thrown into a leadership position after Long Feng fled and I abdicated the throne, she has had to contend with enemies from all sides. She knows next to nothing about the creeping crystal and likely thinks we're some rebel group trying to grasp for power. I don't think she's working with Long Feng, though I am aware it is a possibility, and I am sure she constantly wonders if he's using her own daily agents to spy on her. I don't like the idea of going back to all that, but we'll do what we can, Aang said, standing. Thank you both for telling us all this. It makes me feel a lot better about everything. Of course, said Ki, smiling. It was a pleasure to meet you, Avatar Aang. Zuko, Azula, and Mai filed out of the chamber ahead of Aang while Ki departed with Bosco, but Bumi held out a hand to stop Aang from joining his friends. Wait, Aang. Before you go, I'd like a word. Aang glanced back at his friends and nodded at them to continue. Yeah, me too, he said. We'll go and find Toph, Azula told him. He noticed how she avoided looking at him in the eyes, and when she turned he couldn't help but stare at her swaying hair as she walked away, lost in thoughts of fireflies and plum blossoms. He hadn't had the time to think about her confession at all, and wondered if he would get the chance to talk to her about it. Bumi went over to scratch Flops's belly when the gigantic creature turned over on his back, tongue lolling out in pleasure. Oh, my Flopsy-wopsy poo. You're such a good boy. He glanced over at Aang. Come on over, Aang, Flopsy loves this. I'll pass, Aang said, giving him a sheepish smile. Gotta get back to the city soon, like you said. Bumi frowned. Who are you? Aang's stomach dropped. What do you mean? I'm Aang. No, you're not, Bumi said. The Aang I know wouldn't pass up the opportunity to play with any animals, no matter how pressed for time he was. He shrugged. I had to change. I'm the Avatar now. Gotta grow up eventually, right? I'll have you know that I am 112 years old and I have no intention of growing up anytime soon, Bumi informed him. And you're, what, still 12? He scratched the back of his head. Yeah, well. Aang, what happened to you? Bumi asked, the sincerity in his voice shaking Aang to his core. He saw sadness well up in the old king's eyes. After all these years, you're still my oldest friend. And my youngest, but that's beside the point. I know you, and I know that this isn't you. This stern little boy who mostly kept quiet and still during our talk, who calculated and carefully weighed his words before speaking them, who spoke of destruction as if he witnessed its despair himself. I have no idea who that is. Aang took a deep breath. I need to know. Are you a member of the White Lotus? Bumi seemed taken aback for a moment, but something like disappointment flashed into his eyes before he replaced it with a shrewd glance. That's a secret. So yes, Aang said. Any lingering doubts he had about Kunna and Piandao evaporated. Wu is wrong about you being insurrectionists. Well, we are, from her point of view, Bumi said with a shrug. We do a lot of things that she and the Council of Five wouldn't like. So she is right, but from a different angle. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at each other as if measuring up the other. Aang let out a sigh, breaking the stalemate first, and came to a decision. If he couldn't trust Bumi, who could he trust? So I may look like I'm 12, but I'm something like 15 or 16. 115 or 16, Bumi corrected him. Wait, so that makes you older than me? Well, I kinda feel like it sometimes, Aang said, grinning. Typical of Bumi to focus on a detail like that. I know you said you were bored of exposition, but I've got something to tell you. Katara had spent most of the following day with Jet. Despite being fairly new to Ba Sing Se himself, the boy was well informed. She feigned ignorance as he gave her a tour of various neighborhoods in the lower ring, introduced her to members of his little gang, and explained the inner workings of life here. He had formed a rapport with plenty of cooks and shop owners and other notable members of the community, helping to keep the other kids fed. In return, he and his other freedom fighters kept the neighborhoods safe from rival gangs and smuggled various medicines, legal or not, around the city. He even hinted at more secretive work that involved helping with the refugee situation. He also insinuated, on several occasions, that they were recruiting. She had laughed him off every time. Downplayed her own skills. Given a faulty demonstration of the way she wielded a short, thin blade. But it seemed to make him want to recruit her all the more. She led him along as he guided her through the city, unintentionally showed her key access points to the waterways underground, and explained how nobody liked the Daily, so he knew all the best ways to avoid them. Late in the afternoon, she went back to the cramped apartment and ran into Sokka and Gashiun out front, who had just returned from gathering supplies. "And where have you been all day?" Sokka asked, shooting her with an accusing glare. "Oh, I met someone," she responded. "He gave me a wonderfully enlightening tour of the city." Sokka practically hissed at her and drew in close. "Are you crazy? What if you let something slip? We're here trying to do what we can to not draw attention to ourselves. You've been underground with all of our men for days. And you're out there just going native." She lowered her voice and the air around them chilled. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I'll have you know that I learned all kinds of useful information from this person. So much that if we never even meet Gashiun's sister we would probably be fine." "We will find Nagi," Gashiun said at once. His dark eyes hardened. "Do not back out of our deal." Sokka pushed Gashiun along toward the apartment, rubbing away his goose prickles. Yeah, no one's backing out of anything. We might even be meeting her later tonight. But don't worry, Katara, I'll pick up the slack in your grand plan." She spun on her heel as they walked off, deciding that she didn't want to go back with them quite yet. Picking a random direction, she stormed off toward the entry point to any of the underground waterways, hoping to do some waterbending away from any prying eyes. Katara reminded herself that it was stupid and reckless, but waterbending was one of the only things that managed to calm her when she was angry. When she turned the next corner, she almost bumped into Jet. "What are you doing here?" she asked him, wondering what he might have seen. "Are you following me? Did you know that guy?" Jet asked, glaring toward the direction of the apartment. It felt as if he didn't even see her. "The one with one eye." He knew Sokka? She improvised with the first lie that came to mind. "I only just met him," she said, putting a hand to her chest and trying her best to sound hurt. "I took pity on him. I saw an eye like mine and wondered if someone had taken out his other eye in some false sense of retribution. When I tried to offer some kind words, he blew me off. He's just a sad, bitter man. I've met him before," he said, switching his gaze downward to her. He stood close to Katara, almost protectively. "That guy's a waterbender, June. We have to do something." He moved to go past her, hands twitching to his swords, but Katara put a hand on his arm to stop him. "Wait, Jet," she said. "If what you say is true then we shouldn't make a scene. We need to warn somebody." The Daily. Well, it had been fun. Now she had to bloodbend him somewhere no one would find his corpse. "Not them," he said. He clenched his fist and let out a frustrated sigh through gritted teeth. She thought he was going to punch something. "Are you sure he is who you think he is?" Katara asked. "What if you're mistaken?" "I'm not," Jet said. "He was traveling with the Avatar. I met them together weeks ago, and now the Avatar's here in the city, too. I don't think he knows." "The Avatar?" Katara's eyes lit up. "You know him?" She was careful not to put the emphasis on the word "you" to avoid offending him. "Then we should go tell him. He can do something." "You're right," Jet said, straightening. It seemed like it took an enormous effort to hold himself back from ambushing Sokka right then and there. "Aang's in the upper ring. Let's go." Katara was lucky that he didn't see her smile. Aang paced back and forth in their house while the others watched him and waited for him to organize his thoughts. His conversation with Bumi had gone well, the mad genius didn't doubt him one bit. He felt a lighter burden every time he revealed his secret, but at the same time it felt like his friends from back home faded further from him, becoming less tangible, like they were becoming a story instead of part of his past each time he shared them. "So are you gonna stop pacing anytime soon or tell us what's on your mind?" Toph asked, leaning with her fist pressing into her cheek. "You might actually start digging trenches into the floor." "I'm just trying to make sense of everything," he said. "Things are going a little bit differently than they did back home and it's kind of confusing." "Because Long Feng isn't the Grand Secretariat here?" Mai asked. Aang nodded. "I guess so. Princess Azula infiltrated the city and took it over from the inside by gaining control of the Dali. But this time there seemed to be even more factions to worry about. He didn't know if he could juggle them all, find a way to stay on top of things when he still couldn't be sure where his enemies lurked. He had relied too much on his foreknowledge up to this point, and now that things had changed it left him feeling frustrated that he couldn't predict things anymore. The Council of Five. The Grand Secretariat and the Dali. Both paranoid, both indirectly working against each other, but if Ba Sing Se was to avoid being conquered they would need to work together. The Creeping Crystal, White Lotus, and Freedom Fighters, at least they had a tangential connection to each other. And Jet didn't seem to be brainwashed this time. Thinking back, he allowed a moment of morbid amusement at the fact that now Jet worked for a faction that operated out of Lake Laogai, the place of his death. Regardless of where Jet stood, he wanted to try and save him this time. Or would those events leading to his death never even come to pass? Long Feng, who still played the game but lurked beyond it. Aang had no idea what to do about him all the way in the Fire Nation except to stay vigilant. Sokka, Katara, and the Water Nation. The most important piece to consider, but he wasn't sure how they'd factor into things here. The whole thing just gave him a headache, like playing a Pai Sho game without knowing any of the rules or strategies. "You're sure you can trust that crazy old coot with your secret?" Azula asked. She tapped her fingers on the tea table, nails clacking against the wood in a rhythm Aang found distracting. "He doesn't seem like he's all there, you know. I'm aware, and I do trust him. He's a med genius and one of the greatest earthbenders in the world." "Just like Toph," Aang said, his face set in a way that he hoped would brook no arguments. Toph hooped but said nothing. "Zuko, you sent word to the palace?" Zuko nodded. "Yeah. Everyone's alright, and Wu said she was glad to hear of our safety. They're still trying to figure out who attacked, so they've been trying to track them through the tunnels all day and night. They didn't catch anyone in the Creeping Crystal or Freedom Fighters either, from what I can tell, so that's good. The Roku warriors can act as your liaison to the Creeping Crystal while we're here in the city," Mai offered. "We'll send any messages back and forth that you need us to." "Great, thank you," Aang said, smiling. Mai's aid in this world was welcome, too. With so many factors that had changed in this world, he felt confident that Ba Sing Se's fate would proceed differently, but for better or for worse, he couldn't say. Gashiun had kept busy during their time in the city, Sokka learned. The Sandbender had scavenged for information on the Dali since they arrived, trying to find any word of his sister. Women among their force, especially those as young as Nagi, seemed to be rare, so he'd been able to narrow down his search. For their first 2 years of service, agents were confined to the lower ring to keep the peace, so Nagi should have been among those. Gashiun had also learned that those Dali seemed to have no known headquarters in the lower ring. They mostly used the tunnel system running under the city, which made Sokka anxious to find Nagi as soon as possible. Sokka begrudgingly admitted to himself that they would need her if their men were to avoid any Dali patrols. As it was, the city was on high alert due to rumors of an attack on the palace the previous night, so Yu and the Water Nation soldiers withdrew to the caverns in the outer ring. He feared the raid would set back their own planned attack and once again considered the idea of cancelling the whole thing and cutting their losses to retreat. He looked ahead at Gashiun, wondering once again what the Sandbender would gain from helping the Water Tribes take over the Earth Kingdom capital. Did he really have no allegiance to his own people? He walked through the streets with purpose, unheeding of the people who rushed by them to return to their homes. Ba Sing Se felt empty, but Sokka assumed the Dali must be watching everything, unseen, as they hunted for the culprits behind the palace attack. "Hey," Sokka said under his breath, just loud enough to get Gashiun's attention. "I have an idea. Play along." Gashiun hesitated just long enough to indicate that he heard Sokka, but kept walking. "You Sandbender!" Sokka shouted suddenly, pointing an accusatory finger at Gashiun's back. "You're one of the ones who attacked the palace, aren't you?" Gashiun whirled around, eyes wide, and in one quick motion he shot his hand toward Sokka. Sand rushed up from the ground at Sokka's face, but he ducked underneath the blow and ran the other way. The ground shifted below him as sand rose up to entangle his feet, but after stumbling briefly he managed to regain his footing and run toward an alley. Someone help! Sokka yelled out, grabbing a pole from a fishmonger's stand that had closed for the night. The wooden pole had an iron hook at the end that he brandished at Gashiun, but Sand rose up to grasp at Sokka's weapon and rip it from his hands in a very waterbender-like way. He'd never known that sandbenders used waterbending forms. Could he have learned it from Katara? He turned around and ran into the shadows of the alleyway, but Gashiun reached him and spun Sokka around to pin him against the wall, holding him in place by clenching the front of his shirt. "What are you doing?" Gashiun hissed, close enough so that Sokka could feel his warm breath on his face. Sokka smirked, unfazed by the murderous look in Gashiun's eyes. "Trying to get you arrested," he said in a low whisper. "I figured that'd be an easy way to see your sister, and she'd get you out of there once you explain you did it to find her. And if it doesn't work and I never see you again? Big deal." Gashiun held the position, his calculating eyes boring deep into Sokka. "That's a reckless plan. Better than wandering around aimlessly, though," Sokka replied. He cleared his throat, feeling uncomfortable with Gashiun pressed so closely to him. "Are you gonna let me go now so we can continue this charade?" Gashiun let go of his shirt and stepped back, allowing Sokka space to continue running from him. Before Sokka could get more than a few paces, Sand snaked around his ankles and tripped him up, sending him face first to the ground. He turned back to glare at Gashiun, who had a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. He was enjoying this. Sokka scrambled to his feet again and ran, shouting as he went. But before he reached the end of the alley a shadowed figure appeared in front of him, standing straight, an ominous figure with the light of the street lantern behind him. The figure wore long robes and a cone-shaped hat. "You've come to rescue me?" Sokka exclaimed, clasping his hands together in a gesture of gratitude. The Daily agent jabbed forward, encasing Sokka's enjoined hands in stone, and bound his feet right after, making him fall to the ground. Behind him, he heard chains clinking as Gashiun fell to the ground as well. "You're both under arrest for suspicions of crimes against the Earth King." Chapter 18, The Second Guru. "I knew I could never hide the truth from you, Bumi. A huge part of me is glad you were able to pick it up so quickly. You're the only person in the whole world who knew me all those years ago, knew how much I had changed since then. Appa, too, I suppose. I think it makes him sad sometimes, but it's not like he can say anything. Years ago, Toph told me never to change. That's like telling the wind to be as unyielding as a mountain. I broke that promise. I didn't mean to. But wasn't some part of me always like this? In my world, when I lost Appa in the desert, I was so full of rage and helplessness. I took the life of an innocent creature for the first time. On other occasions, I've raged at my friends for things I didn't actually blame them for. Thinking back, a lot of those times were to defend Appa or some other part of my culture. The anger inside of me was always there. It's just that now I'm long past hiding it. So now you're hiding the kid inside of you, who you really are?" You asked. I didn't have an answer for that. What gives? Why was I arrested too? I didn't have anything to do with the attack on the palace. Sokka pulled against his bonds in vain, holding back his curses for the Daily. They held him in a dark room that smelled of mildew with walls and floors of wood to hold Gashiun's earthbending in check. Metal bars split the room in half and separated them from the 3 Daily agents on the other side. Sokka's brain worked in overdrive as he tried to think of a way out of the situation. He had no one to blame but himself for getting arrested, but he didn't think of the possibility of his plan backfiring this badly. If they found out he was a waterbender. Gashiun's metal chains clinked as he struggled and writhed against Sokka's back. I didn't, either. It was just a stupid ploy. I want to see my sister. One of the Daily, a man with a brutal scar across the bridge of his nose, sneered at him. We'll see about that. A pending investigation suggests Sandbender involvement in the palace attack. And we're not completely ruling out Water Tribe culprits, either, he said, shooting Sokka a victorious smirk. Sokka glared right back at him. He's not Water Tribe, Gashiun said, his defense taking Sokka by surprise. He ran away from one of their colonies when he was a kid. Oh, so he's a mud baby, said the Daily agent. Just as bad, if you ask me. Gashiun's voice broke and his head fell. Just let me see Nagi, please. The agent chuckled. Sokka wanted nothing more than to give him another scar. Begging now? Well, it's your lucky day. I happen to know Nagi, she used to work here until she got promoted up to the palace. Won't she be disappointed to see her dear little brother involved in an attack on the palace she fights to defend? He turned around to depart. Might take some time. Who knows if I'll even be able to get a hold of her. I haven't decided yet if I want to. After he left, Sokka nudged Gashiun in the arm. Thanks for defending me, he said. Gashiun scoffed. Is that some of your infamous sarcasm coming through? No, Sokka said. Really? Gashiun had the opportunity to out him and Katara and the whole invasion force beneath the city, but he didn't. Sokka supposed that had to count for something. His eye scanned the room beyond the metal bars, trying to formulate a plan and adjusting for Gashiun's involvement. He suspected the Dai Li used this as a headquarters in a makeshift prison until their prisoners could be transferred somewhere else. From what Sokka could tell, it was a simple one-room building in the lower ring, perhaps one of many for each neighborhood. The two Dai Li left in the room with Sokka and Gashiun sat on plain wooden stools with a shipping crate as their table, upon which they played a bone dice game in boredom. They waited through the better part of the night before the door opened to admit a new arrival. Another Dai Li agent, this one a young woman, perhaps a year or two older than Sokka and Gashiun, who wore a brown cowl beneath her conical hat and an unadorned copper circlet across her forehead. She had a thick, black braid that poked out of it and fell to the base of her throat and eyes as dark as Gashiun's. Sokka's first thought was that she was really pretty. Gashiun! She exclaimed, pressing right up to the bars to examine him more closely. Her face hardened. How could you do something so foolish? Gashiun recoiled as if stung by a scorpion beetle. I haven't seen you in so long. I missed you, sister. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, turning to her colleagues. Might you two leave us? I'll be fine. Only one Dai Li agent got up to depart, but the other remained. No can do, Nagi. You know the rules. She sighed but then turned back to Gashiun. You're lucky that Kong likes to brag to me about anything he can. I never would have learned of you otherwise. She snapped her fingers. Really bad timing to get arrested, Gashiun. The people of Ba Sing Se are really distrustful of our people as it is, and some rumors are beginning to arise about Si Wang's involvement in the attack on the palace. We had nothing to do with it, Gashiun said. This was just an idea we had to find you. Nagi's shoulders fell as if she had deflated. I'll see what I can do. I may have gotten promoted recently but my standing among the Dai Li is tenuous at best and you jeopardized that. You may be able to walk free but there will still be an investigation and if you're lucky, a trial. And I dearly hope you entered the city through legal means. Gashiun averted his gaze. I don't know why you're so determined to be part of a group that looks down on our people. They don't care about Si Wang. It's all fine, Sokka said, putting on a cocksure smile. We didn't do anything wrong, so there's nothing to worry about. So, how about getting rid of these chains? Nagi switched her gaze to him. Who is this? Tseng, Gashiun said quickly. A friend of mine. He helped me find you. She pressed her palm to her forehead and shook her head. I'll see what I can do to get you out of here. But it may take time. The morning came, and with it the songs of crested birds with russet plumage. Aang rose from bed early despite staying up through the long hours of the night, his sleep troubled by constant planning and thinking in circles, so after the sun rose he decided to go outside into the garden outside of their house to watch the birds and hopefully settle his mind enough to meditate. He didn't bother to put on a shirt, but he did reach for a plain brown robe that he hung over his shoulders. He slipped through the back door, his bare feet soft against the lacquered cherry wood that lined the outside of their house. Wooden pillars made of the same wood held up a pergola upon which hung twisting vines. Tiny white flowers sprouted along them, snaking along the ivy and coating much of the back of the house. He sat underneath the ivy and looked over the koi ponds just beyond a coating of white gravel that covered the ground and layers of slate that formed the border around the still water. A sparrow landed near the water's edge, but one of the crested birds squawked and scared it away. Appa calmly munched on a bundle of hay off to Aang's right, just outside the fence of the Koi Pond Gardens, and gave off a low rumble of greeting. Aang closed his eyes and sat in a lotus position, listening to the far-off sounds of the upper ring as nobles and government officials began their day. He focused on the more pleasing sounds, the birds in the sky, the wind in the trees that disturbed distant chimes, running water in the canal that flowed through the streets beyond. He smelled the overpowering lacquer beneath him and passed that to the earthy aroma of the soil and trees, the algae stagnant upon the pools. He thought of plum blossoms and fireflies in Azula, but that picture in his head also brought to mind Princess Azula and the revelation that she had been there all along, behind this Azula's eyes. Preying on his friend. Watching him and everything he did. The sound of a lemur chattering pulled him from his musings. Literally, Sabi had jumped on his head and tugged at his ears. "Sabi, not now," he said, stubbornly keeping his eyes closed. But she insisted, prattling as she moved to his back and pawed at his robe. Aang sighed and opened his eyes, only to see Sabi the lemur sitting in the gravel in front of him with her head tilted in something like confusion, her floppy ears pressed back against her head. "What?" He jumped up and twisted around, but whatever creature that had clung to him had ducked under his arms and coiled up to his shoulder. A ringed tail slapped against Aang's face and he reached up to grab it, but it flicked just out of his reach. Tiny, furry hands wrapped around his head and nuzzled into his hair, but he pried the creature from his head and held it in front of him, eyes wide in disbelief. "Momo?" he asked, his voice tentative. The new lemur looked at him with wide eyes and started flapping and screeching, struggling against Aang's grip. Startled, he let go, only for the lemur to launch at Aang again and climb around his torso. Sabi arched her back and hissed, but flew directly at Aang in what he could only assume to be protectiveness, and suddenly Aang found himself caught between a whirlwind of two screeching, fighting lemurs. "Hey, wait. Both of you, cut it out. What's happening?" The sliding door behind Aang pushed open and Azula came out, her hair in disarray and clothes bedraggled. "I do not like being woken up so early by all this screeching." Zuko and Toph came out right after her, the former with his blades at the ready. "Where did that come from?" Zuko shouted above the din. Aang's efforts to calm the fighting lemurs were in vain, but they finally stopped when Appa trudged over and unleashed a deafening roar that was sure to wake up all of the upper ring. Both lemurs promptly disengaged, Sabi curling around Aang's legs while the new arrival flew over to Toph's head. Finally, Toph said. "But this isn't Sabi on my head, is it?" Aang peered closer at the other lemur now that it sat still and nuzzled against Toph. Something inside of him tugged at the lemur, a tendril of energy that connected them both, and Aang remembered the words of the swamp bender from ages and ages ago. "We are all connected." Aang's face split into a grin. "It's true. It is Momo, it has to be. The lemur from your world?" Zuko asked. "Like, physically?" "The same exact lemur you knew." "I don't know," Aang said. It might have been impossible to tell for sure, but he found that it didn't matter. It felt like a piece of home had come back and found him. Sabi sniffed the air, hesitantly approaching Momo. "Did you see this?" Azula asked. She held up a rolled piece of parchment tied with string. It was on the ground. "No," Aang said, brow furrowed. "I guess Momo must have brought it with him." She unrolled it, briefly scanned its contents, and handed it to Aang with something like a frown marring her features. "It's for you." He accepted it, confused, and read the tiny scrawl aloud for Toph's benefit. "Avatar Aang. I hope this letter finds you well. You may recognize this little lemur as an old friend of yours, I found him quite recently. What a bundle of energy he is. His intelligence and loyalty are nothing to be scoffed at. Just like another, in another time and another place, I have no doubt that he will make his way to you with this letter. You are connected, after all. But I also wrote this letter to deliver grave news. The spirit world is in disarray, as I am sure you know, and it is only getting worse. As the Avatar, it is your duty to do something about this, first and foremost. We will work through this conundrum together. I am sure you remember where to find me. Guru Puthik. You know him?" Zuko asked, his voice low with suspicion. "How?" "I do," Aang said. But more concerning was that Puthik seemed to know Aang. And I need to go to the Eastern Air Temple. You do? Azula asked. She clenched her fist in readiness. Let's go, then. Aang shook his head. No. I think I need to go alone. Who is this guy? Toph asked. I don't think I need to remind you guys about the last time we met a weird guru. And he kind of kidnapped Zuko. But he seemed to know something about your other world. Aang moved the conversation indoors, lost in thought. Last time, when he left Ba Sing Se, he returned to find that everything had begun its descent towards disaster. But Puthik's knowledge might be too valuable to ignore, regardless of how much he knew about Aang's world. Last time I met this guru, he taught me how to use the Avatar state, he said. Even here, I haven't been able to control it. Didn't he venture into the spirit world, putting all of this into motion in the first place, to regain his connection to the Avatar state? Would Guru Puthik have all of the answers? Back in his world, he never heard from the eccentric old man again. It was like he had vanished off of the face of the earth after Sozin's comet came. He barely heard his friends discussing things behind him until Azula put a hand on his shoulder. Why do you have to go alone? She asked. He looked into her piercing golden eyes, hawk-like in their intensity. Calculating, but determined. He put his hand over hers and removed it from his shoulder. Last time I left to go meet him, Princess Azula took that time to infiltrate the city. I wasn't there to stop her, and Sokka and Toph also left for their own reasons. That train of thought also brought him somewhere else. Toph's parents weren't alive in this world, so if things proceeded the same way she would have no reason to leave. But Zuko and Azula. The front door opened and they all looked to see Mai standing in the doorway. She stepped inside and closed it behind her. Good, you're all here, she said. Word from the Creeping Crystal. Bumi says they're allied with a contingent of Fire Nation soldiers stationed in Chameleon Bay. A man named Oze leads them and he requested help from the Creeping Crystal. She averted her eyes. I remember you told me once, Zuko, that he's... Aang let out a lungful of air he didn't know he held. There it is. What timing? Father, Zuko breathed, eyes wide. He's nearby. Aang, you don't seem surprised, Azula said, peering at him, her face devoid of emotion. He crossed his arms, goose prickles tingling at the back of his neck as he considered the idea of meeting Oze in this world. Azula was one thing. Katara was another. But he didn't know if he could handle seeing the Fire Lord himself. I'm not, he said after a moment. If you two want to go meet him, I'd understand. Toph shrugged. Yeah. I don't mind staying behind with Madame Dreary and whipping Katara into shape if she tries anything. I don't want to work on getting the Council of Five or Wu on our side, though. Mai rolled her eyes at the nickname. I don't know, said Zuko, frowning. He looked at Azula. Father. Dad. It'd be strange to see him. And this might sound crazy, but I'm not sure if I'm ready to. And I know Aang wouldn't want to see him at all. Azula put a hand on her hip. Not surprised at all, Zuzu. Part of me might have jumped at the chance a while ago, but we've gone 2 years without seeing him and I don't feel the need to rush to find him anytime soon. She looked back to Aang again and snickered. Besides, remember how Aang reacted when we tried to go leave with Zhao? He might get angry at us again. Aang frowned. I don't want to get between you and your family. Not again. Azula scoffed at that. We haven't really been a family since Mom died. Besides, as you said, we're needed more here. But we have Toph, Mai, the Roku warriors, even Jet, and the Creeping Crystal. No, Aang, Azula said, her voice hard. That's final. We're staying, so you go run along with that guru and do what you need to do. She looked away from him, then, as if in dismissal. Yeah. We'll keep an eye out for Katara and Sokka, said Zuko, clenching his fist. How did the Fire Nation invade last time? It was just 3 of them, Aang said, turning away from Azula. Something else seemed to be on her mind and he wasn't sure what. Azula, Mai, and Ty Lee. They infiltrated the Kyoshi warriors and took down Ba Sing Se from the inside. So maybe that means, they might try to take over the Roku warriors. They all looked at Mai, who shrugged. I guess that's possible. A bunch of my people are still stationed at Sanctuary Gate, or along the route from here to Lake Laogai, so we're kind of spread thin. All right, Aang said. He felt a little more comfortable now at the idea of leaving Ba Sing Se for a little while. Then you guys start an investigation. Send word to Sanctuary Gate and make sure all of your people are still there. Toph should be able to find out if anyone's not where they're supposed to be, or if someone's in disguise. Aang, said Toph, her voice brusque. We can handle this. Just go. He felt a rush of gratitude toward his friends, especially because part of him suspected Zuko and Azula didn't go see Ozai because of what they knew about the Fire Lord and respected his feelings about that. But Azula swiped her hand at him, her eyes like fire. Go. He put up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Okay, let me go get changed first. Zuko sighed in a way that would have made Mai proud as he worked through his morning rituals to prepare for the day ahead. Ducked over the washroom sink, he splashed his face with cold water to wash away the remains of shaving cream, a necessity, since the soft peach fuzz on his face did not make for convincing facial hair, so he kept his cheeks smooth instead. Cold droplets dripped down his bare chest when he stood upright and examined himself in the mirror. Focusing on his breathing, he tended to his inner flame like Azula taught him and watched as the water turned to steam and drifted away. He grinned at his reflection. He never realized gaining the ability to bend would give him small joys like that. How much did his sister and Aang and all the other benders take for granted? He must have been the first person in history to develop bending after not being born with it. Strangest of all, it felt natural, like a part of him had been missing and had returned to him. He promised himself that he'd never take his new gift for granted and offered silent thanks to the prince who had bequeathed it to him. For just a second, long enough for Zuko to think he imagined it, he saw a nasty burn scar imposed over his eye in the mirror. He brought his hand up to his face, startled, and let out a breath of relief when he felt smooth skin beneath his fingers. He shrugged into his red and yellow sleeveless vest and tied it shut with a sash across his waist, leaving his hair artfully tousled. It felt good to wear Fire Nation clothes again after Aang had insisted to the point of paranoia that they blend into the Earth Kingdom. He left the washroom and felt a familiar weight on his shoulder as soon as he got to the main hall. Sabi drifted down from the rafters to land on him, purring softly into his ear. She stayed behind while Aang brought the new lemur, Momo, with him to the Eastern Air Temple. Looks like it's just us, Sabi, he said, scratching the lemur behind the ears. All the girls left me behind because none of them wanted to head to the palace. Now how is that fair? Somehow, it had fallen on Zuko to find a way to convince the generals to go to war while they investigated the Roku warriors. Azula had said that it was because he would never give up. He supposed she was right about that. He had even drafted up talking points for his argument to bring forth to the Council of Five, tucked safely under his arm. As soon as he opened the front door to head out, he found himself face to face with Jet, of all people. Jet? What's going on? Sabi ducked behind his head, crouched low. The freedom fighter strode inside, a surly look on his face and a posture so taut he seemed ready to spring into action at any moment. Where's Aang? He asked. Zuko scowled, still bitter over how easily he had fallen to Jet's manipulations in the past. Just because he counted himself among the creeping crystal now, it didn't mean he was trustworthy. He's not here. What do you want? Jet turned back to the door sharply and let out something of a growl. Sokka's in town. I saw him. Did you guys just let him get away from you? Zuko's eyes widened. Seriously? He's not in hiding or anything. Disguised like a soldier. The others needed to know about this immediately. If they caught Sokka in time, they could stop Aang's prediction from coming true. That's not a bad idea, actually. I'm kind of upset I didn't think of that. The voice came from the doorway and Zuko felt fire in his veins when he saw Katara leaning against the door frame, arms crossed. She wore Earth Kingdom clothing, but there was no denying who she was, the coldness in her eyes. Katara! He exclaimed, holding a stance with an open palm and fist. Huh? Jet said. That's June. Zuko sent a flurry of punches at her, his movement causing Sabi to fly up to safety. Fireballs erupted from his fists, but Katara swiped out a hand almost lazily and water met them in a hiss of steam. Sokka's sister, Zuko grunted, focusing as he tried to stay on the move, avoiding her water that slipped across the floor. Jet, to his credit, leapt into action with his hook swords without a word of protest, just a snarl of anger. Katara ducked underneath his blows, her face the picture of perfect ease, flowing like water. Zuko rushed in closer to engage with unsheathed blades, and for a moment he and Jet sliced at only air despite surrounding her from both sides. She bent backwards beneath a double horizontal swing from both of them, their swords locking for just a moment, but Katara conjured water from thin air and froze them together with a breath. Zuko lurched forward when Jet tugged on them, so Zuko let go, fire burning in his palm as he brought it up to Katara in an uppercut. She gripped his wrist and redirected it out of the way in one fluid movement, towards Jet, who wrenched his sword free to avoid it only for Katara to hit him in the gut with a globule of water. The attack sent Jet back to the wall where she froze him in place, and Zuko almost stumbled before he realized she had somehow frozen his feet to the floor. He let out a yell of frustration as he freed himself with kicks of fire, going on a furious offensive of attacks to do anything he could to shake her. He knew it was hopeless. He knew he was outmatched, still only a novice firebender. But he couldn't give up. His muscles tensed, painfully, and then stopped moving. Zuko saw his veins clench, prominent on his pale skin, and against his will his arms clamped at his sides. Eyes wide and hard hammering with fear, he watched as Katara stood before him with fingers splayed like claws. He knew at once what this was, what she had been capable of, but he was not prepared for the horrifying feeling of his limbs leaving his control. The ghost of a smirk passed across Katara's face. "That was slightly more fun than I expected," she admitted. "And I wish I could have drawn it out for longer, really, since I owe you for the little mark on my face." For the first time, Zuko saw the shadow of a burn scar under her left eye and swelled with pride that he had managed to do that to her. But there's not enough time for that. Jet stumbled to his feet behind Katara and she held out a hand to him as well, grasping control of his body. He bent down in jerky movements to pick up his swords, tuck them into Katara's belt, and stand at Zuko's side. The look on Jet's face must have mirrored Zuko's own. What is this? What's happening?" he gasped out. Rage bubbled in Zuko's gut when she held them both under her thrall with one hand, almost casually, while Katara bent to pick up Zuko's dual blades, admiring them as if she were a collector carrying out an appraisal. "I think you should have stuck with using these," she said to Zuko. "Your firebending is pretty pitiful." His jaws opened wide and he yelled in anger, unable to do anything else, and the rage that churned inside him uncoiled like a dragon, slithering up to his chest and then his throat. Flames burst forth from his tongue in a wave of red and orange that he saw reflected in Katara's wide blue eyes for just a moment until she managed to summon enough water to defend herself from the attack. Zuko felt feeling return to his fingers just long enough to throw himself in a tackle at Katara, but she regained her composure quickly enough to halt his movements after he knocked them both to the floor. Zuko stared right into her eyes, his limbs locked like stone again but feeling oddly satisfied to have her pinned on the ground under him. "Still think my firebending is pitiful?" His voice came out in a lower rasp than normal. He felt like he had fried his vocal cords and didn't think he could muster up the energy for another attack like that anytime soon. "That's twice now I took you by surprise." She pushed him off of her, both hands trained on the boys to hold them as still as she could. "You'll never get another chance." The room felt several degrees colder as she rose to her feet, all mirth gone from her eyes. She swept her hands toward the back of the house and both Zuko and Jet dragged their feet to the back door and out to the koi gardens. A canal passed through the back of it, cutting off their property from the rest of the upper ring, far from the eyes of any onlookers. Before this, Zuko liked the privacy it had given them, but now there was no one around to see Katara holding them both under her control. "What are you doing to us?" Jet asked, grunting and struggling against her blood bending to no avail. "How are you doing this?" "I'm taking you to where no one else will find you," she said from behind Zuko. He watched Jet bodily throw himself into the canal and Zuko's feet followed disobediently after. Cold water embraced Zuko as Katara submerged them both completely and dove in after them, the current in her waterbending carrying all three of them away with all the force of a raging river. His lungs burned for air and he grasped at his throat, not even realizing that he could move his limbs again, but it didn't matter because he couldn't do anything else. His fingers couldn't find purchase on the stone that passed by them too quickly. His body slammed into jet and they were a tangle of limbs, both struggling and writhing and completely at Katara's mercy. He couldn't see her anymore, the current was all he knew, and it swept them away until his chest convulsed with breaths never taken and his vision went blurry. Darkness claimed him and his last thought was the agony that his mother once suffered through the same pain he did now. The morning brought Sokka and Gashiun's release from the Daily, something Sokka wasn't sure was going to happen at all. But Nagi pulled through, letting them free with a warning and a promise that there'd be an investigation into everything about their arrival in Ba Sing Se and activities since then. Sokka wasn't concerned. He knew they'd never get the chance before the water tribes took over. Sokka returned to the apartment without Gashiun, leaving him free to enjoy his time with his sister that Sokka wanted no part of. He found Suki, who informed him that their warriors had slowly and cautiously moved back into positions around the underbelly of the city, coordinating along with Yu. More warriors had vanished overnight, dredging up fear and tension among the men, but still they pressed on. However, he'd come to learn that no one had seen Katara all through the night Sokka spent in the Daily's clutches, which worried and infuriated Suki to no end, especially once she had found out what he had been up to. Sokka tried not to think too much about it. Katara ran off in a temper the day before, but he figured she probably just stewed over it and she'd come around eventually once she cooled off. He'd long ago learned that there was no stopping her anger. Once the floodgate opened, all he could do was let it drain away. The smell of meat cooking in a street cart wafted to his nose, and while he couldn't identify the meat itself, it made his mouth water with hunger. Another street cart had fish simmering in an oyster sauce that gave him an unexpected feeling of nostalgia for home, for the hot meals his mother and grandmother prepared together. At first he thought he'd imagined it when the little old woman he bumped into looked like Gran, easily explained because she swam at the surface of his thoughts. But when her blue eyes locked with his, he tensed every muscle in his body. Kunna had come to the Paper Lantern neighborhood to visit Piandao at his calligraphy job, intending to drop off a basket of lunch, rice noodles and chicken pig. So it was only coincidence that she bumped into her grandson on her return home. She saw his jaw clench, his eye wide with surprise. He was truly here, just as the Avatar suspected, which meant that Katara couldn't be far. Every instinct in her along with her sense of duty cried out for her to alert Piandao. Ain. Even the Daily. But her duty meant nothing right now, it had caused her nothing but trouble in the past. She knew what she should have done, but above all she also knew she loved Sokka. In no world could she ever turn in her own grandson, her blood, no matter what he did. Her lip quivered and she reached out a hand as if to cup his cheek. Sokka. His eyes were hard, like ice. What are you going to do now, Gran? It was clear to Kunna that he knew she had all the power in this situation. She couldn't say what he would do with that knowledge, whether he would spring into action or run away and hide, but neither of those things were in Sokka's nature. He had his father's wits, and despite everything he retained his mother's compassion. Both traits Kunna couldn't help but be proud of. Kia's light still remained within him, the exact shade of blue shared in both of their eyes. She had to tell him now before it was too late. Running into him like this could only be the work of the spirits deciding to bless her with good fortune. A small window of opportunity. I'm going to tell you the truth, my grandson, she said, taking his hand in both of hers. He didn't pull away. The sea of people continued flowing around them, unknowing and uncaring of the reunion in their midst. About what happened to your mother on that night 7 years ago. It's time for you to know, and I regret not telling you earlier. But it hurt too much to say. His eye widened again, face slack with surprise, but he quickly recovered his mask. You mean before you betrayed me to the Avatar? The icicle twisted in her chest, a familiar feeling. Yes, she said. Another regret of mine. I never wished for you to go through such an ordeal. She paused and released his hand. Come with me, my grandson. She led him back to the home she shared with Piandao and he followed, wordless, which suited her just fine because she wasn't sure if she could say anything else, like she would run out of words before she told him what she needed to say. She didn't even brew a pot of tea and instead sat down upon the cushions and told Sokka everything. He listened with rapt attention, unable to tear himself away from the truth he hungered for all these years. When tears fell from his eye, she wanted nothing more than to hug him. Part of her expected him to hate her, to decry her for her inaction, but she had to tell him the truth to make up for his loss of trust. Her voice came out in a croak after she finished her story. Can you forgive an old woman her mistakes? He wiped his eye, too proud to let his tears continue to fall. He cleared his throat before speaking. So you've been a traitor to the water tribes all this time? Ever since that day, she confirmed. If he saw her as a traitor, so be it. She looked toward the shuttered window at the sunbeams lancing through, casting them in the orange of sunset. That part I do not regret. Part of me has always blamed Katara, he said, burying his head in his hands. It was childish. It was wrong. But I needed to direct those feelings somewhere. She nodded. I understand that well. If you keep your feelings behind a dam, they either stagnate or burst through. Both of them fell silent, and Kunna wished she had wisdom to offer him, anything at all to help him sort through what she had just revealed. To help him come to a decision. What will you do now? She asked finally. Will you tell your sister? Sokka let out a long sigh. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. My mom, she could be alive. And I miss her so much. She watched him closely, his hand clamped over his mouth and his eye staring at nothing in particular. You are at a crossroads, my dear Sokka. And you need to do what you feel is right. You think too much. He stood, fists clamped at his sides. Well, I feel like I need to go. He walked to the door, hesitating for a moment before opening it, but he didn't look back. Goodbye, Gran. Kunna wondered if she just added another mistake to a life full of them. His grandmother was right, he did think too much. He thought about his mother. He thought about Katara, and how she still hadn't shown herself even as night fell and he descended into the Undercity with Suki to meet up with you. He thought about his father and his grandmother. His grandfather, the previous emperor, a man he scarcely knew. He thought of his tribe and the Water Nation as a whole, and the plan to conquer Ba Sing Se that felt more and more reckless with each passing day. And finally, the Avatar. The boy who tried to befriend him in the most misguided way for reasons he couldn't decipher. The boy behind whom his grandmother had thrown her support. The practical thing, the logical thing, would be to tell Katara he had seen Gran. But was going to his sister with all his problems the right thing to do? That wasn't what he wanted, he was sure of that. But what did he want? He stepped aside to let Suki pass first through a particularly cramped stretch of the tunnels, the low ceiling forcing both of them to crouch down as they walked. Footsteps and low chatter echoed ahead, and when the tunnel evened out again, Sokka and Suki found themselves in a small chamber with a high-arched aqueduct running through it. Here they found Yu waiting for them, standing a little away from Gashiun and Nagi, who currently engaged in a rather one-sided argument. Did you tell father you were coming to find me? No, sister. I can't believe you did something so reckless. I'm sorry for not reaching out, but my promotion came so suddenly and I didn't want to send any letters to, you know. Just in case. I figured that would be the best case scenario. But I had to make sure. By getting yourself arrested. By coming to find you. You should know that things are rarely best case scenario with us. Like that thing with the Hami tribe? Your fault. They stole from us first. Or that time you tried to scavenge from a beetle merchant's caravan only to find that all of them were inside their sand sailors and simply asleep. An easy mistake. Yu shifted uncomfortably as the siblings argued, but looked immensely relieved as soon as she spotted Sokka and Suki. Oh. There you are. It's good to see you too. She walked over and pulled Suki into a tight embrace, who returned it. After Sokka and Katara's constant arguing, I thought I would be prepared for this, she added in a low whisper. But they shift from one topic to the next when they argue. One part of their argument did stick out to Sokka and he latched onto it. So you could have sent your brother a letter all this time and you didn't. He said, crossing his arms. Why not? That could have saved a lot of trouble. The question effectively silenced them both from arguing. Well, you're refugees, right? Nagi asked. Sokka shared a glance with Gashiun, who kept his face impassive. Gashiun still had not, apparently, shared that he worked with the Water Nation. Then you may know about the other safe haven, Siwang City. There aren't many of us Siwang tribes people among the Daily, and they prefer that we don't maintain any connections to our homeland. The leaders of Ba Sing Se all feel threatened by it, and if a city like this feels threatened by you, you tend to do what they say. Sokka swiped his hands in an X shape. Wait. Siwang City? There's a whole city there. Gashiun crossed his arms. Down here, he didn't wear his head wrappings and clasped his dark hair at the nape of his neck. I told you that many tribes have gathered together over the years, and even many outsiders have fled to the desert. But yes, there's a secret city that arose in the heart of the sands as a result of Water Nation expansion. Few in the Earth Kingdom know of it, and the Water Nation knows even less. He gave Sokka a significant glare. And I'd like to keep it that way. And Ba Sing Se feels threatened by it? Suki asked, lips pursed. Why? Nagi shook her head, her copper circlet reflecting the light of her torch. I will not say. The Daily may not be like what they used to be 5 years ago, but it is still dangerous to speak as freely as that. Sokka filed that information away for later. Just another thing added to the pile of thoughts he had to sort through. So why stay among them? Part of it is because I can still do good here, Nagi answered. She turned away from him to stride down another shadowy passageway, her long robes and natural grace making it seem like she could glide. But you'll see the other reason shortly. Nagi and Gashiun led the way while Sokka trailed a few paces back with Yu and Suki. Yu seemed the same as ever despite days spent underground, perfectly placid and determined to carry out the duties set upon her. Even so, she turned to Sokka with her brow creased in concern as they walked. The warriors are growing restless, she said. They are determined not to disappoint, but I worry that they are approaching their limit. They want to fight, and many fear the darkness down here even if they try not to show it. There is only so much I can do to keep them calm. They do not respect me the same way they do your sister. Soon, Sokka said. Once we learn what we need to. He nodded his head toward Nagi's back. She does not seem to know who we are, Yu said, her voice hesitant. Sokka picked up on her unspoken question. Why would Nagi help them? She'd be suspicious if they kept their identities from her and asked about the various underground routes throughout the city. He didn't have an answer for his former betrothed. But how are you doing, Sokka? She asked, her voice low. She tilted her head toward him, blue eyes wide and accepting and almost luminescent in the darkness. You have something on your mind. He scoffed and saw Suki give them both a sidelong glance. Lots of things, he said. I'm just trying to figure out what I want. Suki opened her mouth a little bit in surprise but clamped it shut as soon as he noticed. She looked away from him into the darkness. Yu looked ahead and clasped her fingers together, stretching them out in front of her. Well, if I may be so bold as to give advice, try your best to separate your own desires from what others may expect of you. And then think about what's more important. Sokka scratched his chin, considering her words. His father wanted him to be the prodigal son, a strong successor. Katara was harder to tell, but she loved control. Gran wanted him to aid the Avatar. But he still had a hard time figuring out what he wanted for himself. He realized then that Yu would know much about what others wanted for her. She couldn't make her own life choices and joined the Water Sages of her own volition, to finally have some agency of her own. What's more important? Thank you, Yu. Yu escaped from her bonds of duty, the same ones that shackled the other women in the Water Nation. Gran did the same, in her own way. And his mother had been a victim of it. She gave him a bright smile. You're welcome. Their descent continued. After a while, the stonework changed throughout the tunnels they traversed, shifting to softer angles and centuries of faded mosaic tiles on the floors and the walls. They passed by rows of statues older than anything Sokka had ever seen, long ago eroded by water and somehow possibly even wind, faded in a way that suggested exposure to sunlight. But how? Nagi, what is this? Suki asked, voicing his thoughts. Where are you taking us? Gashiun said you three were interested in the history of Ba Sing Se, Nagi said. And I wanted to show you, think of it as a private tour. No one ever comes down here, not even the Daily anymore. Oh. Yeah, Sokka said in what he hoped was a convincing voice. I love history. Nagi beamed. Well then I'll tell you all about it. Did you know that Ba Sing Se is likely the oldest city in the world? Scholars estimate it was founded around 5,000 years ago. It started as a subterranean city and the people mined for the crystals down here, and over the years they kept building up and up. They eventually moved above ground but still kept building up in layers, which is why statues such as these have been eroded by wind and water. They were once above ground. Isn't that neat? Wow, Sokka said, scratching the back of his head. You really do know your history. It's all part of the cultural heritage I joined the Daily to protect, she said, continuing her walk again. It's great that we have Si Wong City, but with the influx of people we've lost parts of our culture. Many people who live there now never even set foot in the desert before. She tugged on her long braid. Don't get me wrong, I think the blending of different cultures is beautiful as long as people respect each other, but I came here to share parts of our tribe's culture with the people of Ba Sing Se so it would survive. And I must admit, it isn't always what I expected. Not many like our food or music and some even look down on me for being a sandbender, or dismiss me as a scavenger. I think you should have just enrolled at Ba Sing Se University, said Gashiun, wearing a surly frown. You could have studied all the culture you wanted there. The wider Earth Kingdom's culture, maybe, she retorted. We've been over this, Gashiun. It's not what I wanted. There's only one professor who teaches about our culture, and he's knowledgeable and passionate, but he's not part of it. She continued her tour of the catacombs and showed them ruins of ancient temples, terracotta soldiers that fought for a long-forgotten dynasty, and artifacts that Sokka couldn't make heads nor tails of. The whole time, he had the feeling they were being watched. Occasionally he caught movement in the shadows beyond their torchlight or heard soft footfalls, like an animal's, but every time he looked closer he didn't find anything. His patience started to wear thin after a while as the torch wax dwindled and he wondered how to breach the subject about their identities and the infiltration plan. What's this? Suki asked, bending down to pick up something from the corner of what seemed to be an ancient burial chamber, a casket of rusted bronze taking up the majority of the room. I found a pile of books and they seem to be in good condition. You drifted over to her. How interesting. Let me see, said Nagi, appearing at her side in an instant. Don't touch them, they could be fragile. Suki already had one in her hands, but at Nagi's words she held it an arm's length from her. Oh, sorry. Nagi frowned but gingerly took the tome from her hands, peering at the cover as if it were a great treasure and flipping through it. This is strange. This book is a record of Fire Nation sages in service to different warlords, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Some of the pages are charred, though. Unfortunate. What's a book like that doing down here? Sokka asked. He joined them and brushed away sand and dust to inspect the cover of a different book. This one's an anthropological study on a tribe I've never heard of. And there's a water-bending scroll. You pointed out. Sokka saw a string of rope next to it that had been tied into a familiar butterfly knot, obviously done by a water tribesman, which verified the scroll's authenticity to Sokka more than anything else. Gashiun drew back, tense and alert. Someone has been down here recently. We should leave. That's extremely unlikely, Nagi said. We are so far from the city now and I venture down into the catacombs on a fairly regular basis. No one ever comes here. I suppose it's possible I just overlooked these in this specific chamber, but... Sokka's doubts that this plan would never work resurfaced in his mind. Nagi was someone who loved her people too much to turn against them and ally with the Water Nation. This is a waste of time. I agree with Gashiun on this, we need to leave. Right now, he wanted nothing more than to find Katara and get out of there. A cool spring fog enshrouded the white spires of the Eastern Air Temple as Aang approached. The temple stretched across 3 separate mountains connected by a series of bridges, clusters of green rooftops piling up to the sky. He steered Appa around the center spire, eyes peeled for the Guru while Momo bounced back and forth from Aang's head to the saddle. He rounded the mountain and came to a meditation circle on a stretch of flat land, massive stone obelisks encircling it as a place of spiritual power. Appa fell to rest with a low moan of content while Momo curled around Aang's staff. He found Guru Puthik sitting in the middle of it. He had the same impressive white beard and the same threadbare clothes, drinking from a cup that Aang could only assume contained onion banana juice. The circle smelled of incense and damp moss, and when Aang entered it he could feel the weight in the air that meant it was spiritually charged. "Hello, Avatar Aang," said Puthik. Aang bowed before taking a seat in the lotus position. "It's good to meet you, Guru Puthik." The old guru smiled, an ancient, knowing look that Aang remembered well. "Come now, Aang. You know as well as I do that we've met before. In another world, another life. But how do you know that? How is that possible? You forget that I am connected to the cosmic energy in this universe. I know that there are other worlds, countless worlds existing side by side with this one." His brow creased and his tone hardened. "And I also know that all the worlds are in grave danger, the delicate balance between them spiraling slowly but surely out of control. The spirit world sits at the nexus of them all, and it potentially faces oblivion." Aang leaned forward. Roku had already told him this, but did it get that much worse so soon? "What can I do? How do I fix it? I know I don't belong here, but isn't there something I can do?" Puthik shook his head. "Everything must go to its proper place for order to be restored," he said, and for a moment Aang felt the world stop. "Aang, it's time for you to go home." Chapter 19, The Veil. The Titanic nun stared down at him, her face impossible to read. Aang wondered if she judged him, examined the weight of what he had done and what he failed to do. Part of him wanted her to pass judgment on his heavy heart just so he could be absolved of the burden for a fleeting moment of weightlessness. The knot in his back twisted painfully and he took a deep breath, matching her meditative position. But she did nothing except continue to sit among her lichen robes. She hadn't moved from this spot in the Eastern Air Temple in centuries, but plenty of it had changed around her. All of the occupants had left long ago. The bison nursery had fallen to rust and weeds. Even the guru who had tended to this temple had vanished and signs of disrepair had already set in. Rainwater pooled in the nun's lap from the hole in the roof above her head. Soft footsteps approached Aang, stopped beside him, and sat. He knew it was Katara without opening his eyes. "Any luck?" she asked. She joined him in looking up at the nun, her voice hesitant, as if afraid to interrupt his meditation. "I know you've been trying all around the temple grounds. I don't even know if she's Avatar Yangchen or just one of the sisters here." It had been a fruitless endeavor, part of his journey to reconnect with his past lives however he could. But all had been as silent as this statue. Katara put her hand over his. "You'll be able to find them again. I know it. Don't you remember what the swamp bender said, 3 years ago?" The old Aang would have laughed when he recalled the memory, but instead his words came out deadpan. "That thing about pants." "What?" "No." She leaned in closer to him, her shoulders brushing against his, and put a hand to her chest. "Those who are gone never really leave us." I've been holding his words close to my heart. At her words, his arms and legs throbbed with restlessness, with electricity. He stood and his response came pouring out. "If they never really left me, they'd be here to help. They'd give me the power to end this war so we don't keep losing people and we won't just have to be content with holding them in our hearts. I'd rather be able to hug them and laugh with them, but the avatars abandoned me and they're not coming back. I've failed. Worse than ever before. And I don't think there's any coming back from this. Not now, not ever. We can come back from this, Aang. We have to." She rubbed at her arm, her head lowered so her hair spilled over her shoulder. "Because we can't accept the alternative." He turned away from her. He wanted to say he was sorry, that he could fix this, but he was so close to just giving up forever. "Part of me wishes we could all just stay here, in this temple. Hidden away from the world." "It's a nice thought," she said. The smile she gave him wasn't an encouraging one, or joyous. Just melancholy. "Maybe we could." "No," he said. "The war would find us. It always does." The world sped up again all at once. Aang dropped his lotus position, leaning forward toward the guru so his palms pressed flat against the earth. Go home? I can. I can do that? But how? Puthik wrapped his hands around the clay cup of onion banana juice and tipped it just slightly toward Aang. I think you know what I am about to say. His eyes fell to the cup in Puthik's hands and he remembered the first time the drink had been offered to him. He thought back to the swirling pools of water with its flow impeded by muck. I have to open my chakras again, don't I? Your chakras are more muddled than ever. You've been bogged down by fear and guilt and grief. You have lost so much in so short an amount of time. Part of you has found a sort of strength, a sort of meaning, in your suffering. Puthik smiled. That's good, it's the first step to recovery. To renewal and growth. Aang clenched his fists, cutting off the guru before he could continue. Wait, what do you mean? I was meant to suffer that much? That I had to lose all those people important to me in order to find the meaning of true strength. He stood, the rage building inside of him, years of pain that had boiled to a breaking point. That I had to fight and live in fear for 3 years, fleeing from place to place, never knowing what comes next. Who I might lose next. Also I could say I've been enlightened. The guru sat still, like a statue. Everyone on this earth processes their pain and their feelings differently. For some, they may find that meaning in their pain. Let it out. Let it go. Aang's chest heaved and he felt like he couldn't breathe in enough air. He wanted to rip the cup of onion banana juice from Puthik's hands and hurl it at an obelisk so it would shatter. Well, that's not good enough for me. I don't want to find meaning in suffering. I want to find meaning and strength in love and life. Puthik folded his hands in his lap, serene in the face of Aang's fury. You have done the same in many of your past lives and you will in the next. They're not me. Aang paced around the meditation circle, feeling trapped like a tigerdillo in a cage. They may be my past lives but they're not me. You're wrong. If you leave now, you won't be able to go into the avatar state at all. The memory came back to him, unbidden. At the time he'd been so afraid, so angry at Puthik for trying to make him let go of Katara. Aang stopped and fixed his gaze on the old man. And you were wrong once before, he said. After I left here last time, I did go into the avatar state. Just once, for a moment, and I haven't been able to do it since. But that was enough. It told me enough. He clung onto that hope for so long, all that time, just so he could tell himself he could do it again one day. And he had been able to go into the avatar state again, but only after coming to this world. Puthik closed his eyes and smiled. Was I wrong? You clung to the girl you loved as the most important thing in the world. You let your love cloud your judgment, hold you back. At the time, she was not your anchor to the world, but your shackle. And you did let that go all on your own to control the avatar state, however briefly. Princess Azula's lightning put a stop to that. All of Aang's anger drained away, leaving him feeling empty. For a while I thought you tried to say I couldn't find love, couldn't be with someone to one day start a family. But then I learned about Roku, and how he had been able to marry. But all that had been was a misunderstanding all along. Puthik nodded. Roku never let his connection to this world hinder him from doing what he needed to do. His duty as the Avatar. So you never meant for me to forget her completely. That comment triggered another memory, his knowledge of the thought chakra at the crown of the head. When I opened the last chakra, you told me I couldn't have any worldly attachments. Skipping ahead to the last chakra already, are we? At that, Puthik chuckled. There, my friend, I will admit that I was wrong. I have since learned that an avatar's responsibility is to the world, that you can never truly achieve enlightenment because that requires complete detachment. For you and no one else, opening the thought chakra signifies a connection to all the cosmic energy in our world, a connection to your highest self, the spirit at the source of all your power. But never complete detachment. He inclined his head toward Aang, like a bow. So, please, forgive me that mistake. And my comments about finding meaning in suffering, I had not intended to offend you. Aang let out a sigh. It was tiring to hold on to all that anger. Even at my age, we never stop learning, Puthik continued. I would say your past lives are also capable of mistakes, even now, long after they are gone. Like their mistake to send me here. To this world. They didn't expect all this to happen. Aang gestured wide as if to somehow encompass everything that had happened on his journey so far. They had good intentions, said Puthik. Have you learned what they intended for you? Aang wondered. They wanted me to see the world from a different perspective. After all his time here, hadn't he done that? He had come to accept Azula as a friend. He had seen the darkness that all nations, and all people, had been capable of all along. But that couldn't be everything, couldn't be enough. All that, just to learn to accept. To forgive others? Puthik closed his eyes and took a deep breath as if steeling himself for what lay ahead. Back to the subject of worldly attachment. To go back home, you may not need to open all of your chakras again. You just need to follow your attachment to the world. He thought of Katara at once. Of Sokka. Toph. Zuko. That's all. Life is an illusion, and so is death, Puthik said, and the echo of a different man's words reverberated in Aang's ears. But, as I have told you once before, the greatest illusion in this world, in all worlds, is the illusion of separation. Your home is still with us, just within reach. Beyond the veil that marks the world's separation, currently thinner than ever before. All you have to do is walk through it. Aang reached for the energy around them, the touch of the spirit world brushing against his senses. A chill, but also something warm. Chaotic. Alive. Never before had he felt it so close. Beyond the veil. It felt thin. Dangerously so, like something could spill out from behind it. It felt more potent than any solstice. But, you can only be attached to one world. Puthik opened his eyes again. Right now, you are split between this world and your own, and that is causing all of them to be unbalanced. So it is time to choose. He felt, then, as if he had been slapped in the face. What do you mean? There's a choice. You could stay here. If you want. Forever. Forever. For one wild, irrational moment, he pictured it. Choosing to stay in this world of his own volition. Helping to end the war and forming a new life here, with different friends. He thought of Azula, brave, fierce, loyal Azula, who loved him. He'd still have Zuko, Toph, and Sokka. Suki and Bumi and Iroh, alive again, even if they had changed a little. Puthik continued and Aang stared ahead without seeing him, hearing his voice as if from far away. If you chose to stay in this world, once and for all, balance would restore itself. The worlds would go back to the way they were, and you would live here permanently. But then he thought of Katara and the spell broke. His vision of a life in this world shattered to pieces. I still have attachments to the other world, Aang said, and the irony of his statement was not lost on him. After all this time, it was still Katara who tied him to the world, and this time she would guide him back. To my world. I can't leave them. If I stay here, they'll all die without me. Perhaps, said Puthik. I cannot predict the future. But if you want to return, you have to leave now. Right now. As soon as possible, before the storm comes and the spirit world does more than just brush against this one. His heart throbbed heavy in his chest. He would never get the chance to say goodbye, but maybe it was better this way. Aang didn't want to think about what it would be like to tell his friends that he'd never see them again. Zuko would be sullen, but accepting. Toph might use anger to hide her sadness. And Azula. She knew. Before he left to meet Puthik, he'd noticed her dismissive behavior, that something had been on her mind when she pushed him away to go to the Eastern Air Temple. She figured it out all along and knew there'd be a possibility he wouldn't come back. The realization hit him with all the force of an elephant koi. How could he have been so stupid as to fail to notice her pain? Aang hugged his knees. What'll happen to this world when I leave? What'll happen to me? Life will go on here, Puthik said. And you will make it home. Your world wants you back, so it will be easy. No, Aang said. His voice came out low and barely discernible at first but gained in volume as he found his words. I mean, the other me, the one native to this world. The Aang whose life I took. He had memories before I came along, and friends. He had a life, he was sent to the Western Air Temple. He met a girl there and was best friends with Kuzan and Bumi. He rarely thought about these memories, it felt too much like intruding on another person's privacy. This was supposed to be his destiny, to fight against the Water Nation, but I took it from him. At those words, Puthik looked every bit his age. His shoulders sagged and his wrinkles seemed to deepen. That may be, perhaps, the most regretful part of this whole situation, he said. As I said before, I cannot predict the future. It may be that he would simply wake up as if from a long sleep with no memories of your time in his body. Or it may be that he is gone forever, and when you leave the Avatar spirit will pass on to the next in the cycle. Will it hurt him? The childish question escaped Aang's lips. Dying, like that? Puthik sighed, but his words came out soft and comforting with a wan smile. It will be as quick and easy as falling asleep. Aang stared down at his hands. Back when he first found himself in this world, he cursed his body for being weak. For being younger than he'd been used to. But he had no right to do that to the other Aang, to take his body. His hands shook when he thought of the possibility that he'd taken his other self's life. If that's true, then I can't leave. Not yet. If there's any chance at all that the Avatar spirit would go to the next one in the cycle, then I can't abandon everyone here. They would never win the war in time for Sirius Moon to arrive, and they'd go through the same pain we all did. He clenched his quivering fists, his decision made. So you choose to stay here, forever? Puthik nodded and stood. Aang had never seen him look so stiff, his body heavy. No, Aang said. Not forever. Just long enough to finish what I need to do. Puthik folded his hands behind his back. Then you continue to threaten all the worlds. The barriers between them will progressively weaken. The spirit world will fall to chaos and bleed over into every world it touches, the veil blown away. If you continue down this path, you won't be able to go home at all. He swiped his arm as if to punctuate his point. And you'll never be able to control the Avatar state attached to two separate worlds, as you are now. Of all things, a grin flashed across Aang's face and he stood, staff gripped in one hand while his other rested on the hilt of his meteorite sword. You've been wrong before, last time when you told me I'd never be able to go into the Avatar state. I'm going to take the chance that you're wrong again, even with all those odds stacked against me. Puthik stood still, tense, his beard rustling in the wind that blew through the meditation circle. The gale howled through the stone obelisks, producing a kind of music the nomads treasured once upon a time. For a moment, Aang thought Puthik meant to oppose him, but the old guru's shoulders slackened in defeat and he smiled. Well, Avatar Aang, if you mean to persist on this path, I cannot stop you. I admire your tenacity. I'll take whatever the universe tries to throw at me, he said. And I'll throw it back. I'll keep fighting until both of my worlds are safe. Then go, Puthik said, gesturing to the sky with a grin of his own. Do what you must. Bring balance to all the worlds. There's no time to waste. Aang bowed. Thank you, Guru Puthik, he said. Without waiting for a response, he sped off to Appa and held out his arm for Momo to perch upon, ready to go back to Ba Sing Se. Back to his friends. Good luck, Aang, Puthik called to him. For all of our sakes, I dearly hope that I am wrong. Zuko awoke with a sharp pain in his chest and his head. He tried to open his eyes, but his vision felt clouded and bleary, and without warning his chest heaved and he twisted on his side to cough and retch the water from his lungs. When he finished, he noticed that the stone underneath him was cool, and pressing his forehead to it felt soothing on the aches and helped him think clearly. About time you're awake. Zuko whirled to the source of the voice so fast it made him dizzy and he groaned, but when his vision focused he zeroed in on Katara standing far enough away from him to avoid any initial fire-bending blasts. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, but before he could do so much as take a stance she jabbed her arm forward and his whole body pressed flat against the wall behind him. A man standing next to Katara that Zuko hadn't noticed before stomped forward and gestured at Zuko, rock cuffs pinning his wrists and ankles so that his arms stretched out on either side of him. The man was wrapped nearly head to toe in cloth the color of sand, in a style of clothing Zuko had never seen before. Even his face stayed mostly obscured. Thank you, Gashiun, Katara said. Beside him, Zuko found Jet bound in the same way, glaring daggers at Katara and the earthbender named Gashiun. He took the moment to gather his bearings, to figure out where they were and try to formulate a plan of escape. Katara held them in a cavern Zuko knew to be deep below the city, green crystals in clusters together to provide their only source of light. A tunnel extended beyond the rounded bend that Zuko could see, so he knew that this cavern wasn't completely cut off from everything else. Rescue from either the creeping crystal or the freedom fighters could be coming. But Zuko wasn't the type to give up so easily and wait around for someone to come save him. "What's wrong, Katara? Keeping your distance in case I manage to shoot you with some fire again." He smirked, trying to appear confident. "I see you managed to avoid getting a second scar, but how about it? Let me down and fight me again, without your blood bending. Maybe it's our destiny to keep dueling it out." She bristled and took a few steps closer, uncorking her water skin in one quick movement. Water coated her left arm and froze, coming to a sharp point that she wielded like a blade. "Keep talking like that and I'll make sure your destiny ends, right then and there. Permanently." She stepped closer and before he could even think about hitting her with his breath of fire again she gestured with her free hand and his head jerked to the side, exposing his neck to her blade. The ice pressed against his throat, a cold finger that could pierce his jugular at any moment. Steam rose from the point of her makeshift weapon and Zuko grinned again, letting the heat from his body dull her blade. "You're audacious, I give you that," she said, offering a smile of her own. Hers felt more dangerous than anything he could ever hope to achieve. "But you're in no position to fight me. Tell me where the Avatar is." "That's what you wanted all along, isn't it?" Jet asked, hatred oozing from his expression. "You played with me all along so I'd lead you right to the Avatar." Katara turned to him next in her dangerous anger, brimming just below the surface and sharpened to a point that she aimed at Zuko, changed to something else. The shift was smooth and immediate, her tone light and haughty and mocking. "And you fell for it so easily, didn't you? You thought I was just some girl you could charm to obey your every whim, too blinded by your self-righteous crusade against the Water Nation to realize I'd be the one to take you down." Zuko grit his teeth. He needed Katara to be angry. If she got angry, she'd get sloppy. And maybe she'd slip. Maybe then he could take her on or escape. "But you needed to use blood bending to take us down," Zuko said. "And now you have an earthbender on your side. Sokka would fight us fair instead of using some crony to hold us like this." She spun on Zuko again. "Don't speak to me about Sokka. And you're the one who held him in chains." "They were far more generous to him than I would have been," Jet said, his voice low and just as dangerous as Katara's. "I think waterbenders are better off dead than prisoners." In one motion, fast as a chameleon cobra, she formed an ice spike and hurled it at Jet with enough force to embed it into the wall. It sliced his arm on the way, making him hiss in pain. "Be careful or I'll decide I don't want any prisoners either." Katara turned back to Zuko as if Jet were no more annoying than a spider fly. "Now, are you going to tell me where the Avatar is?" "Don't tell her anything." Jet snarled, pulling against his bindings. "If you're planning to invade the city he'll stop you. All of us will." "He's around here somewhere," Zuko said, directing the full force of his glare at her. If she knew Aang had left Ba Sing Se she might begin her attack. He didn't flinch away from her stare. He thought if he had Prince Zuko's scar it would have been more intimidating. "How am I supposed to know where all my friends are? I'm not a control freak like you are." Her eyes narrowed, barely perceptible. "You know nothing about me." Jet kept writhing against the wall in a feeble attempt to free himself. "I know that you're a lying, conniving." "Shut up, Jet," Zuko said. He didn't want to hear hypocritical accusations from Jet right now, not when so much more was at stake. "Yeah," said Katara, keeping her eyes locked on Zuko. "Shut up, Jet." She threw another ice dart at Jet without looking and this one pierced him in the leg. This time, Jet only grunted, apparently it had not pierced him deep. "Trying to silence me now? Typical waterbender. Just fight us fair, you cowards." Zuko couldn't even see where Katara and the earthbender Gashiun had hidden their swords, but he wasn't sure if Jet had noticed their weapons went missing at all. "I'm getting really tired of hearing you," Katara said. She held a hand out to Jet and touched all of her fingers together, forcing his jaw shut. "And you know what? For good measure. She swiped her arm and a flurry of ice shards from her water skin whistled through the air at him, stabbing him all over. Zuko heard a muffled cry of pain from Jet, but he couldn't open his mouth to scream or shout. Jet's veins protruded from his temples, his head locked in place by Katara's blood bending. It looked like even just being held there hurt him. How about it, Zuko? Ready to talk? Rivulets of Jet's blood dripped down to the cavern floor, catching in little crimson grooves that Zuko couldn't look away from while the sounds of screams fought to escape from Jet's throat. Azula expected to find Zuko home when she and Toph returned from the investigation of the Roku warriors with Mai, but Sabi was the only one to greet them when they entered. The lemur glided down from the rafters to land on Azula's shoulder, chattering something at her that she couldn't understand. Azula picked her up by the scruff of the neck and held her an arm's length away, but the lemur continued to wriggle and writhe and try to communicate. Aang was better at this sort of thing. The lemur tended to avoid her most of the time in general, but Azula peered at Sabi in an attempt to discern her unusual behavior. "Toph, do you know what it is trying to say?" she asked. "I wonder if it's hungry." "You speak monkey, don't you?" Toph punched her in the arm, but Azula saw a hint of a grin. "You don't know a thing about animals, do you?" She pressed her palm to the floor. "She sounds panicked about something, but I don't know what." "Nothing seems wrong here." Sabi lowered her head and made a soft cooing sound. Azula, rubbing the arm that was sure to form a nasty bruise, supposing the creature could be kind of cute sometimes. "Perhaps it's just jealous of the new lemur," she mused, and her face softened for just a moment. "Not that it matters anymore," she added. The cold feeling that Aang wouldn't return from his meeting with the Guru still weighed heavily on her. "Think Zuko's still meeting with the Council of Five?" Toph suggested. It had taken them the better part of their afternoon to track down all the Roku warriors that Mai had recalled to the city, and they discovered no evidence of an infiltration among their ranks. Nonetheless, Mai still insisted on traveling by rail to the sanctuary gate to see her other warriors still stationed there in person, so Azula and Toph decided to head back. "I am supremely unconcerned with the whereabouts of my big brother," Azula said, inspecting her nails. Still freshly manicured from when she had them done before the welcoming feast. "Maybe he sought out Piandao to play with swords or something." "I can tell you're lying," Toph sang with a self-satisfied smirk. "Come on. I hate to say it, but we should probably check with the palace, just in case." Azula rolled her eyes and let out a huff, but acquiesced. Perhaps it was better to be safe. Daily agents and royal guards both stood sentinel at the entrance to the war chamber, which both girls found to be odd at first, but when they entered they found a full meeting of all 5 members of the council, the Grand Secretariat, and the ministers. The atmosphere felt heated. Everyone bickered like children. The Council of Five wanted to retaliate against someone, anyone, they could pinpoint as the culprits behind the attack on the palace the other night, while the ministers argued to impose a curfew on the city, and Wu sat with her fingers massaging her temples as if nursing a headache. Azula thought it a wonder that the whole city didn't hear them fighting. This war chamber, in the highest levels of the palace, had a whole back veranda open to the cloudy sunset, overlooking the palace gardens far below. Azula leaned against a black marble pillar and waited. A hapless scribe sitting at a little writing desk next to her nearly leapt out of his seat in surprise when he noticed Azula and Toph, but went back to his hurried scrawling in what Azula thought was a feeble attempt to record everything. "We need to post more soldiers on the wall," General Muku, the intense-looking general with a metal-plated headband, insisted. "Increase patrols in the lower ring," shouted General Zhu Zhang, equally as intense but twice his brawn. She slammed her fists against the table, making figurines on the enormous map laid across it quiver. The attackers would have fled there. General Yoganjin tooted at her. No, you fool of a Zhang. It's clearly an outside attack. Waterbenders. None of them used waterbending, you old crackpot." "Zuko's not here," Azula whispered to Toph as they watched, both too amused by the proceedings to interrupt. "He'd be sitting in silence, too much of a pushover to get a word in with all of this. The Daily should continue investigating any people among the lower ring with an existing criminal record," squawked an old minister that Azula had met at the party and found too unpleasant to remember his name. "Particularly those neighborhoods with high populations of sandbender expatriates." Another general, Falan, twirled his long mustache around his fingers. I still believe it to be Long Feng and his forces from Jiduan. The motive is there. Based on what Bumi and Ki had told them, Falan seemed to be closest to the right answer. General Feng let out a long sigh and held up his hand to silence all of the ceaseless bickering. Angela was surprised when they stopped. She had no idea he had commanded that much respect from them all. Wu, have your Daili learned anything about the creeping crystal? Angela didn't react to the question, but she felt Toph shift just slightly on her right side. They'd been about to leave, dismissing them all as a lost cause, when Feng's question pulled Angela back in. Wu still didn't know they'd been in contact with Bumi and the former king. Wu inclined her head toward him. Today, she wore a hat with a rectangular black mortar, like a sort of crown, with beads that tapped together when she moved her head. The creeping crystal has remained silent in the past few weeks, she said. We still know regretfully little about them. I see, said Feng, leaning back in his chair with something like disappointment. As I was saying, those sandbenders. The arguing continued as if uninterrupted, but a messenger scurried into a room bearing a scroll that he handed off to a magistrate, who unrolled it, read it, and strode around the table to whisper in Feng's ear. What was that about? Toph asked Angela under her breath. That guy seemed excited about something. Or nervous. Angela eyed the magistrate closely to try and read his expression. Feng sat up again, his face grave. News from the Fire Nation, he said, palms pressed flat against the table. As of yesterday, Jiduan has been conquered by the water tribes. Beneath him, Lake Laogai shimmered like fire in the sunset, its waters tranquil as Aang passed by overhead. He had the thought to return here on his way back from the Eastern Air Temple to inform Bumi to keep an eye out for Katara and Sokka's machinations. After landing Appa on the lakeside, he rounded the shores to feel out the vibrations around it, searching for the secret tunnel that led to the headquarters beneath the lake. His earthbending senses had improved over the last few weeks. He found the entrance after only a few minutes of searching and descended with a triumphant grin on his face. The energy in the tunnels and secret rooms felt much different from the last time he had been there. Before, they'd been on high alert after the palace attack, earthbenders and soldiers in a motley of different types of armor and clothes bustling back and forth. Now, he saw men and women pass by with scrolls tucked under their arms or overseeing the various refugees that had been filtered into the city in secret. One of them pointed Aang in Ki's direction, and that path led him down into the catacombs. He found the co-leader of the creeping crystal in a cavern half lit by green gems with the other half lit by a guard holding a torch. Ki examined the remains of a stone archway set into the rock framing the cavern's exit, in front of which stood a statue whose face had crumbled away eons ago. Bosco slept at Ki's feet, his breaths the only noise in the cavern. The guard nodded to Aang when he entered and got the former king's attention, who turned around and greeted him with a smile. Hello, Aang, said Ki. Were you looking for Bumi, by chance? He's working alongside our earthbenders to form a new tunnel arrangement leading to our headquarters. I was, Aang said, shrugging. Bosco let out a sleepy grunt and adjusted. But that's okay. I just wanted to let one of you know that I've been a little worried about the water tribes attacking the city soon. Is that so? Ki asked. He tapped his chin, thoughtful. Do you have any reason to believe this attack is forthcoming? Aang scratched the back of his head. Just a feeling. But my feelings usually tend to be right. Ki nodded and smiled again, adjusting his warhammer slung to his back. I see. Bumi told me to trust your judgment, so I will. If they come, the creeping crystal will aid you in battle, and I will fight alongside you on the front lines myself if need be. Aang's eyes jumped up to the mighty warhammer. He still found it hard to believe that this was the same King Ki he knew in his world, a timid, naive man who barely knew his way around a political discussion, much less a battle. You know how to use that weapon, huh? Oh, yes, he said, adjusting his glasses by the corner. I took it up 5 years ago once I stepped down from the throne so I could protect my people. I'm no earthbender but I still wanted to do my part. We're a fearsome sight, so they say, Bosco and the warrior king, riding into battle. He gestured to the sleeping bear and turned back to the archway, which had ancient words scrawled on it that Aang hadn't noticed before, faded away by time. But if you ask me, I'd rather be known as a scholar king. I've learned so much about my nation's history since coming down here myself to study it. Aang scrunched his eyes in an attempt to read the worn-away writing. What does it say? Ki grinned as if excited to talk about his latest discoveries. It describes this as the entrance to a mausoleum. There used to be a building here, but it was forgotten long ago and centuries of history got built above it. I'd like to begin excavating soon, but the tunnel's mostly collapsed and I want to try to avoid destroying anything else as we navigate through it. A mausoleum? Aang asked. For who? He fought the urge to step back from the archway, which suddenly felt creepy. He sensed the same kind of spiritual charge that he felt in the meditation circle at the Eastern Air Temple and wondered if this might be a place that intersected with the spirit world. This ancient queen, I suspect, Ki said, indicating the faceless statue. She wears armor, so I thought her to be a simple guard at first, but she is made of a more expensive stone than the terracotta figures we usually see down here, which indicates a higher rank. And she wears a pin on her lapel, do you see it? He pointed closer and Aang saw a groove in the rock that seemed roughly flower-shaped. That suggests that she is royalty and, with the armor in mind, a fierce fighter. Adding that all together, she is likely to be High Queen Shima of the Onyx dynasty or Queen Li Quarong, her aunt. Both in a dynasty long before my family, some 1500 years ago. Wow, Aang said, impressed. You really know your stuff. He had never heard of any of these people. Ki beamed at him and was about to respond when hurried footsteps resounded down the tunnel toward them. Aang closed his eyes for just a moment to cast out his seismic sense. A man in sandals approached, one he didn't know, but the stranger didn't seem to be aggressive or even panicked. Another piece of history stepped into their cavern, a Sun Warrior man, of all things, shirtless except for a gilt brass gorget that shimmered in the torchlight, matching bracers, several long beaded necklaces, and golden bands around his biceps. He wore his black hair like Prince Zuko did when Aang first met him, shaved except for his phoenix tail, pinned straight and smooth as silk. Aang had a hard time placing his age. He saw no wrinkles in the dim lighting and his vibrant golden eyes were sharp and inquisitive. He gave both Ki and Aang a short bow, not subservient. Aang was pleased to see. Ki, he said. His eyes slid over to Aang, and a warm smile smoothed his sculpted cheekbones. Seeing him closer, Aang placed the man in his 30s or 40s. I bring news. But first, I am honored to meet you, Avatar Aang. Ki held out a welcoming hand. Ah, Aang, this is Zabao, an associate of Bhumi's who has been staying with us for a few weeks now. Aang bowed in greeting. I didn't expect to see someone from the Sun Warriors here, he said. My people like to remain hidden, Zabao said. But I still cling to the ancient ways, like your friend Bhumi. His eyes twinkled and Aang realized the meaning behind his words, White Lotus. But more on that later. I have come to inform you of Jiduan's fall to the water tribes. Ki crossed his arms and Bosco stirred, grunting and yawning awake. Long Feng, any word of his fate? Zabao shook his head, his phoenix tail swaying. Regretfully, your scouts reported nothing of him in their messenger hawks. The Water Navy continues to blockade the Fire Nation mainland, but the Golden City has mounted a counter-offensive. Ki grit his teeth and for a moment Aang saw a bit of the Warrior King in him. That fool, if only he'd stayed here instead of splitting our people even further. Now all of his citizens, many of them my people, have nowhere else to go. He rubbed his temples. I wonder if Long Feng weakened himself due to his petty desire to attack the palace the other night. The Great Divide has widened, Zabao said, and Aang hoped he meant in a metaphoric sense, but with everything going on at once he couldn't be sure. Let us hope the Golden City does not forsake them only because they are from a different nation. Aang frowned. They wouldn't do that. He had faith that Ty Lee would push to do everything in her power to help those in need even if they were Earth Kingdom. Zabao looked at him and Aang felt the warmth of a hearth fire. How can you be so certain? Does the world not feel split to you more than ever before? Even a tribe of my own people have fled to the highest peaks of the Earth Kingdom a century ago due to a simple disagreement, whom to my understanding you have met before. Aang pondered his point and had been about to reply when Bosco growled at something in the darkness and a squeaking animal emerged from the shadows beneath the archway. All 5 sets of eyes in the room turned to face the other tunnel only to find a fox back on its haunches with its tail puffed out, defensive. A fox? Ki asked. What could that be doing down here? At the sound of his voice, the fox squeaked out another cry and turned around to run back where it had come from. A knowledge seeker, Zhe Bao said, his voice almost reverential. How fortuitous. Aang knew those foxes. A sense of foreboding fell over him and he wondered at the accuracy of Zhe Bao's assessment. Ji Duan has fallen? That means they can't have been behind the attack on the palace. Does this mean the Golden City will ask for aid? Think that Snake's still alive, or did he surrender to the water tribes? The war chamber erupted into an uproar once Fong broke the news of Ji Duan's fall. Azula stayed silent, churning with the long-term ramifications of such an event while the city's leaders argued the short-term. Despicable as he was, Long Feng led one of the few bastions aside from the Golden City still standing in the Fire Nation. With Ji Duan's fall, the rest of the island nation was sure to follow. She clenched her fists and could only hope that her village would remain unnoticed or be logical and yield if the navy came again to their shores. Despite the Golden City holding most of the Fire Nation's power, they did nothing to unify the people, they didn't lead. So many towns and villages would be done for. She knew her people would fight. There was no honor in yielding as soon as the enemy showed themselves. And they would die. They're all like children, Toph muttered, angling herself to the side as if to pick up on individual voices better. This reminds me of a freedom fighter dinner, everyone shouting above one another to make their voices heard. But nobody's listening. Fong's voice, once again, broke through the din. Grand Secretariat, he said. Offer us your wisdom again. Something about his words sounded disingenuous to Azula, like they were layered with a tone of sarcasm. You told me once, privately, that you believed Long Feng to be behind the attack on the palace banquet. Wu folded her hands over one another, her multitude of rings and bangles rattling together. I did. And I still believe so. General Falan and I, at least, seem to be of one mind on the matter. Falan scoffed. I did say that earlier, but it's obvious I was wrong in light of what we just learned. Why would Long Feng send his men here while the water navy laid siege upon his city? That lily-livered. Toph's voice came out low and deep with anger. His backbone just folded in on itself as soon as it suited him. Azula stayed silent, waiting to see how this would unfold. Wu seemed affronted. Well, how am I supposed to know the answer to that? Despite their hidden faces, my Dai Li agents recognized the fighting style of those who used to be among their ranks. Behind her, her 2 Dai Li guards, a man and a woman, nodded in agreement but said nothing. General Muku leveled her with a stern glare that reminded Azula of a bullfrog. You've been nipping at shadows ever since you've been appointed to this office, Grand Secretariat, seeing enemies where there are none, even making up some of your own. I need not remind you of your secret evil Pai Sho group. A chorus of laughter rose up around the war table from the generals and ministers alike. Wu scowled at them all. Made up? You think the White Lotus is made up? We have evidence of them forging entry documents for potentially dangerous refugees, allying with Daophii groups outside of the city, and most of all, infiltrating every level of our society, likely to spy on us. There are Water Tribe members in their ranks. Who do you think they're passing their information on to? Azula was careful not to narrow her eyes too much, just in case someone saw her and thought she might know more about the White Lotus. She wondered where Wu had gotten that misinformation, though part of her also knew parts of what Wu said were technically right. Beside her, she felt Toph stiffen. Things were getting bad and Azula had an idea of where this might be going. I think she's just deflecting the blame away, Falan said, pointing a finger at Wu. The attackers fight like Dai Li? Well, we have Dai Li right here in this city, look at their history. Look at who leads them now. Guards, Fong said. Bring in Agent Nagi. Royal guards trooped through the door with a struggling woman in a Dai Li uniform held between them. Azula had never seen her before. Wu stood and faced the door, her chair scuffing loudly against the floor. Nagi. She shot a glare at Fong. What is the meaning of this? Nagi has been arrested for releasing a prime suspect in the attack on the palace the other night, Fong said, his voice calm. A sandbender from Si Wang, her brother. And a possible water tribe male. My brother and his friend just did something stupid, Nagi said, composed but with dark eyes narrowed in anger. You suspect him only because he's from Si Wang. They had nothing to do with the attack. One of the ministers piped up. It makes sense to me. How else would the attackers sneak into the palace unseen if not through inside help? She's stationed in the palace, isn't she? I've seen her before. She's telling the truth, Toph said, loudly enough for everyone to hear her. Everyone in the room seemed to notice her and Azula for the first time. I can tell when people are lying. General Muku folded his arms. Can you? How convenient. It is commonly known that the people of the Si Wang Desert have a solid reason to want to consolidate more power. This war has been nothing but good for them, with the waterbender attacks expanding their desert, it expands their regional boundaries. More refugees going to that blasted place increases their influence. There are whispers that they've formed a whole city of their own. What if that power gets to their heads and they set their sights on Ba Sing Se next for more territory? Esteemed companions of the Avatar, Fong said, steepling his fingers together. Please, stay out of this. That is a ridiculous accusation. Nagi protested, staring at Muku with indignation. How dare you? General Yoganjin stroked his long, white beard. This Nagi reports directly to Wu, does she not? I think it prudent to launch an investigation into them both. I agree, Fong said, closing his eyes. I am sorry, Wu. Guards, take them both into custody. Wu looked around in alarm as the guards closed in on her, closing their grips around her arms. Her daily escorts stood back and did nothing, which surprised Azula, no loyalty there. This is an outrage. Wu exclaimed. We all know you're just putting on airs and this is an arrest. You have no evidence. Azula had to clench Toph's shoulder hard to keep the earthbender from attacking everybody right then and there as the guards took away Wu and Nagi. Not now, Azula whispered into her ear. We'll get Aang. If he even comes back. I am genuinely sorry, Wu, Fong repeated, letting out a long sigh. I have truly enjoyed your friendship. But shouldn't you have foreseen this? Katara, where did you and Gashiun go? I'm getting sick and tired of these extended disappearances. Sokka stood with Suki at his side when Katara returned to their apartment late in the evening looking even moodier than usual. She walked right past him and Suki, ignored Sokka's words, and looked out the dusty window into the night. He thought she had dried blood on her sleeve but couldn't say for sure in the dim lighting. Gashiun didn't come back with her, Sokka also noticed. Katara, what's going on? Suki asked, her voice softer than Sokka's. My source for the city's underground routes led to a loose thread I needed to cut, she said. That freedom fighter turned out to be a companion of the Avatar. Sokka slapped his forehead as he pictured them, all of them, in disbelief that they'd somehow found his sister. Freedom fighter? Don't tell me your source was a guy named Jet. What happened? He led me to where the Avatar's been living in the city, Katara continued, her pacing erratic. But only the firebender boy was there. I had to get rid of them both, Gashiun sealed them up in a hole underneath the city somewhere. But now we have to begin the attack before the Avatar finds out they're missing. So tonight's the night? Suki asked. Want me to go tell you to mobilize the men? They should be in position. But there's still so much we don't know yet, Sokka said. Katara, you have to see reason. We can't rush into this. He hadn't told her about running into Gran, the story of their mother. He needed to move, to do something, but he didn't know where to begin or how to say it. Part of him also inexplicably worried about Zuko, despite being enemies, the other boy didn't deserve to die like that. The other part of him remembered the torture that Jet and his gang basically put him through, and the pain, the tiny cuts all over his arms and legs that Sokka did a rough job of healing. They left scars that would eventually fade, but the memory of them never would. Maybe Jet could stay down there. No, said Katara, her voice firm. She stared at Sokka so directly and defiantly and so unlike the women of their tribe that he didn't have the words or the strength to push back against her, especially since he also saw a bit of their mother in her eyes. I'm starting to think you're trying to delay the attack, brother. A full moon is only 4 days away. I did like your plan to wait until then, but this will have to do. It's close enough. Relay the orders for the raid to begin immediately. Wait, Sokka said, holding out his arm. Katara looked at him as if about to blow up, and he clenched his hand and dropped it back down to his side. Just tell the men not to hurt the bystanders. The vast majority of the people in this city have nothing to do with the war, they're just trying to live their lives in peace. And greed, Katara added, narrowing her eyes at him. But she sighed. Fine, I'll give the order not to hurt the oh-so-innocent townspeople. We'll hold the city hostage until the leaders surrender, but I can't promise no one will get caught in the crossfire. When did you get so soft, Sokka? Did Gran get to you? She said it mockingly, but Sokka remembered his grandmother's words. Yes, he said. I suppose she has. I'll go with you, Suki, Katara said, heading to the door. She looked at Sokka with something like disgust but otherwise ignored his response. Guess I'll give our men a little inspirational speech before we begin. The Earth Rails didn't normally run so late to the lower ring, but as an important guest to the city and a companion to the Avatar, Mai had certain privileges. The carriage was empty except for Mai, 2 of her Roku warriors accompanying her, and an official escort meant to guide the trio to the sanctuary gate. Soon, they would reach the lower ring station, where they were to make one more transfer on a rail to the outer ring and eventually sanctuary gate, to Mai's other warriors. I'll never get over how pretty the city is at night, said Xiao, a young woman who was by far the most bubbly of the Roku warriors. She let out a dreamy sigh. It's like a bunch of twinkling stars, but on the ground. Despite her demeanor, Xiao was the most proficient among them at close-range fighting with her knives. Round-faced and good-natured, with hair done up in 2 buns, Mai once found her annoying, but since leaving their island she'd come to appreciate the other warrior more. Crescent Island is pretty at night, too, you know, said Lu Mao, a willowy, easygoing boy, best at imitating demeanor and accents to blend in on spying and infiltration missions. You just have to look at the village from the beach. The earthen rail slid to a stop and all 4 occupants looked around in confusion. Mai stood, eyes narrowed in suspicion as she directed her gaze out into the night. I'm sure it's nothing, said the guide, a pretty woman who introduced herself as someone named Judy at first, but quickly corrected herself as if breaking an old habit, and now Mai didn't know what to call her. Perhaps just a stray rock in the track. I don't know about that, said Xiao, pointing out of the window to a middle ring neighborhood. A fountain froze over and then exploded outward, blowing chunks of rock and ice everywhere. In another part of the city, Mai saw a spout of water shoot up from a well, and Lu Mao spotted at least 3 more. Men in blue rode in the water pillars, spilling out to Ba Sing Se's streets in droves. Water tribe! The guide exclaimed, gasping. They've finally infiltrated our city. Mai went over to the carriage door and slid it open and listened to the sounds of panic outside as warriors assaulted the city. Xiao, Lu Mao, let's stay together, she said, leaping out the door onto the roof of a building below. Both obediently followed and all 3 drew their weapons. We'll have to stem the tide as best we can until help arrives. At first, they fought as they did best, from the shadows, flitting from roof to roof and alley to take out as many enemy warriors as they could. The water tribe attacked as if in a berserk rage, aimless destruction their intent at first until Dai Li agents started to fight back. Warriors wielding spears, clubs, and machetes led the way and waterbenders emerged from the underground after them. Their behavior didn't seem right to Mai. From her experience, the water tribe preferred guerrilla warfare and devastatingly effective but carefully planned tactics instead of attacking all at once. She wondered if they'd been especially restless and eager for fighting. Earthbending civilians emerged from their homes to help, but many were cut down. Mai didn't know when fire entered the equation, but entire city blocks went up in flames in moments. She suspected it to be a countermeasure against the waterbenders, but all it did was add to the chaos as wood burned and groaned and collapsed and smoke stung at her eyes. The abundance of fountains and ponds in the middle ring added to the waterbenders' ammunition, and she knew it would only be worse in the upper ring. She could only assume the same things happened all around the city. Earth Kingdom soldiers were the slowest to arrive onto the scene, the first sign of an organized counterattack. By that point, the waterbenders and warriors had spread and joined up with their own who came up from other parts of the city. They blockaded with water and ice, more than holding their own despite being in the Earth Kingdom's stronghold. All the walls were useless. Now, the bulk of the Earth army stationed at the outer wall and beyond would never make it to the inner city in time to make a difference. Aang might not either, Mai knew. She fought and she struggled, picking up her fallen knives and needles when she could and throwing discarded Water Tribe weapons instead when she couldn't. She knocked out one Water Tribe warrior with his own boomerang that didn't come back to her when she threw it and dodged around another warrior's spear to leap back into the shadows of an alleyway. Xiao disarmed the warrior with the spear and knocked him out with a hard hit to the head even through his wolf helm, while Lu Mao joined Mai in the alley and replenished her stock of throwing weapons with more that had been scattered around the battlefield. "We have to regroup with our warriors stationed at the palace," Mai told them, pressed against a wall and breathing heavily. "Hopefully someone will send word to our own at Sanctuary Gate. But we need to find Zuko and the others, too." "You got it, Captain," Xiao said with a grin, pumping her fists. They'd been about to move into action when the ground rumbled. Mai thought it to be an earthbender attacking at first, but it continued, making the buildings around them quiver. The trio emerged from the alleyway, looking around. Sounds of battle faded away as everyone stopped in confusion. An earthquake? Lu Mao wondered. Where water had emerged from wells and fountains and spouts, now sand erupted in pillars dozens of feet higher than the water did. It was as if the Si Wang Desert itself heaved up from underground, spilling all over the city. The ground under Mai's feet lurched and she almost lost her balance, but she grabbed Xiao and Lu Mao's hands and ran for higher ground toward the center of the city. Far away, loud crashes thundered out as buildings toppled and people screamed. A gong sounded out an alarm but faded away just as quickly. Mai's blood pumped as she ran, shouting at everyone to move, to keep moving, keep running. Something far worse than the attack seemed to be happening. She had no idea who she urged forward, whether they were Water Tribe or Earth Kingdom. A cloud of dust came from the walls separating the middle and lower rings, and for a moment Mai thought the walls had fallen. It rolled over the city like a sandstorm, blinding and choking. Stone ground against stone somewhere far off, adding to the cacophony. She wondered, for just a moment, if earthbenders could have done this. But this quaking was too great, too powerful to be the work of humans. An avatar, maybe? Was Aang here? Could he have done this? He wouldn't, unless something even more terrible had happened. Dust, dirt, and sand obscured her vision, but Mai pulled her friends into an open door to escape the rolling clouds. A shopkeeper ushered them inside, a girl scarcely older than them. She shuttered the windows as soon as the three of them made it to relative safety indoors. Coughing and sputtering, all three Roku warriors found themselves covered in a layer of dust and sand from head to toe, specters who had wandered into a flower shop. "What happened out there?" the shopkeeper asked, eyes wide with fear. The quaking had stopped and Mai judged this building to be structurally sound. Mai turned to the shopkeeper once she recovered enough to breathe. "Do you have rooftop access?" Yes. In the back." Mai leapt over the back counter toward the back room and a set of rickety stairs, Xiao and Lu Mao hot on her heels. She found a door and covered her nose and mouth with her sleeve before she pushed it open. Her first feeling upon coming to the rooftop was inexplicable melancholy. She found a garden full of all different kinds of flowers rendered the same color by the powder, strangled under a layer of sand. For a moment, the whole city felt smothered in silence and dust. Toward the wall to the upper ring, a sandstone tower that wasn't there before broke the skyline, taller than anything else in the city except for the walls themselves. Situated at the top of it, standing on a minaret, was a massive, monstrous barn owl, of all things. Its wings spread, flapped twice, and it took off in a soaring lap around the city. Next to Mai, Lu Mao gasped. He wasn't staring at the tower or the owl, but out across the city. The dust had settled and Mai's eyes widened in horror at the scale of the destruction. All around the middle ring, whole neighborhoods collapsed, an expanse of rubble and open pits that led to darkness. The tunnels and catacombs underneath the city had caved in, taking the city above down with them. No words came to Mai's lips at the sight. A voice echoed out in the sky and it took Mai a moment to realize that it came from the owl. "If I can't have my library in the spirit world, then the human world will have to do, again. Even if I have to wipe out this entire city to claim it." Check the description for the links to the author.